Hey there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. Before we drift into tonight's tale of Letters from Beyond Ooo, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up, let's begin. Tonight we start with letters carried across ages that have not yet arrived. Letters written by beings who live in futures far beyond the borders of Ooo. Futures where the grasslands have turned to silver dunes and the oceans have mellowed into still and quiet basins of shimmering blue glass. Futures where stories of Finn and Jake are not memories, but legends whispered by lantern light. The voices that write these letters do not speak with urgency. They speak like someone dusting off an old photograph, holding it gently, wondering who the smiling figures once were. The first letter arrives like a drifting feather. It comes from a scholar who lives in a city built upon the softened bones of mountains. They have never seen a human with their own eyes, yet they write of Finn as if they have dreamed of him every night since childhood. In their world, humans have become myth, a distant possibility carried forward through traces in stone and fragmented lullabies. They describe how children in their age fall asleep to stories of a boy with a shining spirit and a loyal dog whose laughter shaped the air around him. They wonder if Finn was real, or if he was an idea that the world needed in order to remain gentle. Another letter comes from someone living in a future where magic has thinned to the faintest whisper. They write about how the sky once shimmered with elemental currents, and how ancient devices buried in crystallized earth sometimes hum softly in the night as if remembering. They collect relics not to study them, but to listen to them. They call themselves a caretaker of echoes. They speak of finding a shard of candy-colored glass that vibrates when held against the chest, as though holding the warmth of a kingdom made of sweets. They imagine a ruler with a crown of sugar and a heart full of kindness. They wonder what became of her and why the world lost the taste of sweetness. Further along the river of time, a different voice writes from a future filled with quiet machines that float like dandelion seeds on the breeze. This being explains that technology and magic finally learned to coexist, not as rivals, but as gentle partners. They describe forests with glowing roots and tower tops shaped like the petals of giant flowers. In their age, stories of Ooo are not considered history, but ancestry. They speak of how every invention carries within it a spark that once belonged to a distant adventure. They wonder if Jake's stretchy nature became a metaphor for adaptability, and if Finn's bravery became a philosophy rather than a memory. There is another letter, too, this one written with a steady calmness. It comes from someone who lives long after stars have cooled to embers. Their world is dim but serene. They write of how the universe slows its breath but does not fear the stillness. They say that even in fading light, tales of Ooo remain like constellations drawn across the mind rather than the sky. They ponder whether the Lich was ever truly defeated, or whether his absence is simply the silence that comes when fear no longer has form. They say that in their time, sorrow has softened into wisdom. Each letter feels like a fingertip tracing the outline of a forgotten mural. These writers do not mourn the past, yet they feel its presence like the warmth left in a room after someone has quietly stepped away. They speak of how their world inherited gifts they do not fully understand, seeds that sprout into trees with faces, rivers that sing when the moon rises, shadows that remember names. They write with curiosity, not with longing, and their words drift like candle smoke rising slowly towards the night air. Some letters come from futures where new species walk the earth, creatures with crystalline skin or fur that sparkles with frost. They describe learning languages built from harmonies rather than words. They tell of how dreams are shared among communities, allowing history to be remembered through collective slumber. In these futures, the story of Ooo becomes a dream that everyone can visit. A shared resting place woven into the subconscious of a world that has moved beyond the familiar shapes of the present. A tender voice from another future writes of a world where every being carries a small fragment of ancient magic within their chest. They say that no one is entirely alone because every heartbeat contains a memory of someone who once wandered the land seeking purpose with a sword and a smile. They wonder if Finn ever knew how far his story would travel, or how deeply it would take root in ages that would never meet him. The letters continue, floating gently forward through time, and each one paints a picture of a future shaped by the quiet echoes of heroes and kingdoms long gone. The writers do not try to recreate Ooo. They simply listen to the remnants, like someone listening to the final notes of a song and feeling it resonate in the stillness that follows. They speak of ruins not as broken remnants, but as gentle reminders that every age leaves a soft fingerprint on the next. One letter describes a wandering traveler who walks across an endless plain of moss-covered stone shapes. The traveler believes these shapes were once buildings, perhaps even castles or cities, but in their time they are simply part of the landscape, worn smooth by centuries of patient wind. The traveler carries a small book of stories passed down through countless generations. And in those pages, Finn and Jake appear not as adventurers, but as guiding spirits who represent companionship. They write that whenever someone feels lost, they imagine a boy and his magical dog walking beside them. And somehow the path ahead becomes clearer. Another letter arrives from a future that feels more like a dream than a world. The writer describes how clouds drift low enough to touch, and how people weave strands of sunlight into cloth that shimmers like warm honey. In their age, they do not speak the name Ooo, but they refer to the old age of wonder. They believe that during that time the world was young and playful, and they see it as the cradle of imagination. They say that some children are born with a small mark shaped like a tiny crown, and elders whisper that it is a blessing from a ruler made of candy who once loved her people so deeply that even time could not erase the sweetness. There is a letter written by someone who lives beneath the surface of a calm and ancient sea. They describe a city of shells and coral lit by glowing algae. They say that their people found strange relics buried beneath sediments far below. Among them was a small metal device shaped like a game console, cracked and worn, but still warm to the touch. They write that when placed near the heart, it plays a faint melody that sounds like laughter drifting through summer air. They do not know the word BMO, but they believe the relic contains the soul of a playful spirit who once told stories to keep loneliness away. The writer says that when the melody plays, even the waves seem to smile. One future scribe writes from a place where night never fully fades and stars hang low like lanterns. They describe how constellations shift into shapes that resemble faces and hands and ancient symbols. In their world, astronomers are also historians, tracing cosmic alignments to uncover forgotten eras. They write of a pattern in the night sky that resembles the curved horned silhouette of the Lich, not as a being of terror, but as a reminder that even the darkest forces eventually dissolve into quiet. They say that their people do not fear this constellation, but regard it as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that life continues even after shadow. Another letter comes from a settlement built inside the husk of a colossal tree. The inhabitants believe the tree is older than any written record and that it once served as a home to guardians of the land. They speak of carvings found deep within its rings, symbols of wolves, swords, and stars. They believe these images tell of a time when a hero sought identity through trial and tenderness. They refer to him as the Echo Wanderer, and though they do not know his name, they write that his spirit guides those who seek meaning without violence. They say their children play in the tree's hollow chambers, and when the wind blows, it sounds like gentle laughter echoing through the roots. Some letters come from futures where the world has grown quiet, not from desolation, but from peace. In one such letter, the writer explains that their people no longer build cities or kingdoms. Instead, they wander with the seasons, listening to the earth breathe. They believe that long before their time, the world endured conflict and chaos, and that the natural balance was restored by lessons left behind in forgotten myths. They say that sometimes, while sitting beside a fire at dusk, they feel as though a friendly dog curls beside them, and a brave young boy hums softly in the fading light. They do not question these sensations. They simply smile and let the warmth settle into their bones. Another future voice speaks of floating gardens that drift across calm waters, tethered only by vines. They say that their people cultivate flowers that glow softly at night, and that when the petals fall, they form shapes of crowns, swords, or musical notes upon the water's surface. Elders teach that these symbols are echoes of ancient stories, and that they represent courage, loyalty, and joy. The writer wonders whether these symbols are coincidences, or whether the world itself remembers. There is a letter written by someone who studies time not as a line, but as a pool. They believe that memories ripple outward, touching eras far beyond their origin. They write that sometimes, while meditating, they glimpse visions of a boy with a green backpack running across sunlit fields. They do not know who he is, but they say his presence feels like a promise that every ending circles back into a beginning. They write that their people believe time is not something that moves forward, but something that blooms like a flower opening petal by petal. In each petal lies an age, a memory, a story, and somewhere near the center is the era of Ooo, glowing like a lantern flame. They say that when they touch the water surface, they feel the warmth of that flame, even though countless ages separate them from it. They describe this sensation as a comforting hush, like being wrapped in a blanket woven from stardust and old lullabies. Another letter comes from a future where the sky is filled with slow drifting islands suspended by gentle currents of forgotten magic. The writer lives on one of these floating lands, surrounded by fields of soft blue grass that sways even when there is no wind. They explain that adventurers of their time do not seek treasure, but seek memories left behind in the air itself. Sometimes, they say, when standing at the edge of the island, they hear faint echoes of a heroic shout or a playful bark, as though the sky itself remembers moments of joy. They wonder if these echoes are remnants of Finn and Jake, still wandering through the layers of existence like friendly clouds that refuse to disappear. One particularly poetic letter speaks from a future where beings do not communicate with words at all. Instead, they speak through gentle light that pulses from their bodies in soft rhythms. These rhythms represent emotions, stories, and histories. The writer explains that in their world, an entire community gathered to share a light pattern that told the tale of a human boy who protected a world made strange by magic. They say that even though their kind could not pronounce his name, they felt his courage as a warm glow and his kindness as a silver shimmer. They describe how their people drifted into sleep feeling as though someone was watching over them from beyond the veil of ages. There is a letter sent from a future deep beneath the earth where vast caverns sparkle with crystals that hum with ancient resonance. The writer explains that these caverns contain hidden chambers filled with murals that depict scenes of adventure, friendship, and transformation. They believe these murals were not made by hands, but by the earth itself, remembering the age of Ooo as though it were a beloved dream. They describe a crystal formation shaped like a stretching dog, and another like a sword raised toward the sky. They say that when the crystals sing, the tones harmonize into something that feels like hope. Another voice writes from an age where seasons no longer follow one another, but blend softly, like colors brushed together on a canvas. In this world, winter melts into spring without boundaries, and autumn whispers gently into summer. The writer says that their people believe the world became this way because the elements themselves softened over time, no longer clashing or battling for dominance. They tell of stories passed down about an age when elemental beings shaped the land, and how their fierce spirits eventually turned into quiet guardians of balance. They wonder whether Princess Bubblegum's steady logic and Flame Princess's burning spirit were early hints of this final harmony. There is a letter from a solitary watcher who guards a tower overlooking a coastline made of shimmering black sand. They write that the waves carry fragments of ancient objects, glass marbles, scraps of fabric, curled pages from long-forgotten books. The watcher collects these objects and places them on shelves inside the tower. They say that one night, while arranging the items, they found a simple, hand-drawn picture of a boy and a dog smiling beneath a shining comet. They do not know who drew it, but they describe how looking at it filled them with a quiet warmth that stayed with them long after the sun rose. They say that sometimes the simplest artifacts carry the greatest truth. One letter drifts in from a future where dreams themselves have become a form of travel. The writer explains that sleepers in their age can wander through shared dreamscapes, moving through memories preserved by the collective unconscious. They describe wandering through a dream meadow filled with towering yellow flowers, where a faint tune played on a non-existent flute. They say that in the distance they saw two figures, a lanky dog and a young boy, walking hand in hand beneath a sky of swirling pastel clouds. The writer approached, but before reaching them, they awoke with tears on their cheeks and a feeling of profound peace. They believe that some dreams are gifts sent from ages long past. Another message arrives from a future where the world has grown quiet and contemplative. In this age, people spend their days listening to the murmurs of rivers and the rustling of leaves. They believe that the world speaks to those who listen closely. The writer says that while sitting beside a calm stream, they once heard the water whisper the word hero with a tone so gentle it seemed like a song. They did not know who the word referred to, but they felt their heartbeat slow and their breath deepen, as though someone long forgotten was offering reassurance through time itself. A final letter in this portion of our journey comes from a future civilization that maps emotions rather than geography. They chart landscapes of joy, lakes of melancholy, forests of wonder. The writer says that explorers in their age search not for land, but for feelings carried across generations. They describe finding a vast plain of courage that stretched farther than any other emotional terrain. At the center of it stood a monument shaped like a simple backpack. The writer touched it and felt a calm certainty that bravery does not roar, but hums softly, like a lullaby comforting the night. They write that their explorers rested there, letting the stillness soothe them. They believe the monument represented someone whose courage shaped ages beyond their own, someone whose gentle strength echoed through the roots of history. They wondered how a single life could ripple across so many eras, touching dreamers, wanderers, scholars, and keepers of memory. They wrote that even without knowing his name, they felt guided by his presence, like a lantern glowing softly in the dark. Another letter comes from a future where music forms the foundation of all knowledge. In this age, libraries do not contain books, but melodies. Scholars listen to harmonies to learn about ancient times, and children hum tunes that once carried meaning across kingdoms. The writer says that their people discovered an old melody that feels older than any language. It rises and falls gently, like footsteps across rolling hills. They say that some believe it was inspired by the adventures of Finn and Jake, their journeys turning into musical threads that wove themselves into the fabric of time. When the melody plays, listeners feel a warmth in their chest and a sense of companionship, as though someone is walking beside them. There is a letter from a future where beings no longer see with eyes, but with memory. They move through the world guided by the way places make them feel. The writer explains that certain valleys evoke joy, certain forests evoke wonder, and certain mountaintops evoke a strange longing. They say that atop one such mountain, they felt a deep and resonant sense of friendship, a bond that transcended eras. They wondered if two souls once stood there together, sharing a moment of quiet understanding that lingered in the stone itself. They believed that the world remembers emotions even when names have faded. Another voice speaks from a future where the moon shines brighter than the sun. In this world, night is not a time of sleeping, but a time of gentle reflection. People gather beneath the moon's glow to share stories of ages long past. The writer says that in their community, storytellers speak of a time when magic flowed freely and adventure called to the brave of heart. They say that the story always begins with a human boy, the last of his kind, who carried hope like a torch through a world of strange wonders. They do not recount battles or triumphs, but instead speak of his kindness, curiosity, and unwavering loyalty to those he loved. They say this is what their people choose to remember, because those qualities soothe the spirit more than any tale of victory. There is a letter from an age where time has become gentle. Clocks exist only as decorations, and people measure their days by the rhythm of their hearts. The writer says that in their world, patience is the highest virtue, and history unfolds like a slowly turning page. They explain that their elders believe the world learned patience from an ancient era filled with friendships that grew through small moments rather than grand gestures. They wonder if Finn and Jake taught the world that meaning is found not in endings, but in the quiet in-between spaces. They describe sitting beneath a tree and feeling as though someone was telling them that everything would be all right. One letter comes from a future where the world has become a tapestry of memories woven together by collective understanding. The writer says that their people see themselves not as individuals, but as threads in a grand pattern. In this pattern, the age of Ooo forms a luminous center, vibrant and radiant. They say that even though countless lifetimes separate them from that time, they feel connected to it through the shared pulse of existence. They write that the story of Finn and Jake is not a tale of the past, but a quiet heartbeat that continues to echo, reminding them that companionship shapes the world more deeply than power. Another letter drifts in from a future civilization that builds monuments not from stone, but from starlight. These monuments shimmer across the sky like constellations, forming pictures that shift slowly through the seasons. The writer explains that one of the brightest monuments depicts two figures standing atop a gentle hill, looking out over a world filled with wonder. They say that when people gaze upon this constellation, they feel at peace, as though guided by a memory they never personally lived. They believe that this image comes from an age where Friendship was a force strong enough to shape reality itself. There is a letter from a solitary dreamer who lives in a quiet cabin, surrounded by fields of tall, swaying grasses. They write that, although they live alone, they never feel lonely, because sometimes, when the wind rustles through the grass, they hear laughter carried on the breeze. They say that this laughter feels familiar and comforting, like a memory passed down through generations. They believe that some emotions are too gentle to disappear, and that they linger in the world like soft echoes waiting to be heard. A final letter in this segment comes from a future where history is understood as a song that never fully ends. The writer says that every era adds a new verse, but the melody remains the same. They believe that the story of Ooo and the lives that shaped it continue to resonate through every future world, carried forward by those who feel its warmth without knowing its origin. They write that the song is not loud or triumphant, but soft and steady, like a lullaby that helps the universe drift into peaceful dreams. They say that as long as the melody exists, the legacy of Finn and Jake will continue to guide hearts across all ages yet to come. As we slowly drift from the gentle echoes of futures yet to come, we step now into a quieter, more hushed realm, letters from dead universes, worlds that once breathed and laughed and dreamed, now folded into silence, yet leaving behind traces that wander like drifting mist. These are not messages written for the living, but whispers that survive the collapse of entire realities, reaching across the void to brush softly against the edges of memory. Some are hardly more than fragments, tender and fragile, yet they carry the weight of worlds that once existed. The first letter comes from a universe that ended with a sigh, where oceans boiled in reverse and mountains sank like slow, deliberate shadows. The writer speaks from what they call the twilight expanse, a place where time fractured into tiny, glimmering shards, each carrying a fragment of existence. They describe cities that shimmered with crystal light, filled with people who spoke in layered tones, every word resonating with color and emotion. And then slowly, the light dimmed. Slowly, the voices were swallowed. Yet even in this quiet, the writer managed to send one last message, carried by the faint hum of residual magic. They write of their amazement at Oo's enduring vibrancy, marveling at the courage of a boy and a dog whose adventures seem to have etched themselves even into the fabric of universes that no longer exist. Another letter drifts in from a reality that collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. In that world, the laws of physics were uneven, folding space and time into impossible loops. The writer, a scholar of chronology, reflects on the paradoxes that eventually consumed their home. They speak of entire cities folded into themselves, of rivers that ran both forward and backward at once, and of creatures who lived for moments, yet experienced lifetimes. Amidst this chaos, they write, the memory of Ooo persisted like a gentle lighthouse, a symbol of stability amid impossibility. They imagine Finn and Jake as figures capable of threading through such contradictions, guiding even the lost echoes of collapsed realities toward understanding, if only for an instant. A third letter arrives from a universe where silence was the final ruler. All sound and movement had gradually drained from existence until what remained was a pale echo of memory itself. The writer describes standing in a world of still shadows where mountains, rivers, and forests were present only as impressions against a soft gray sky. In their final years, they wrote letters not to be sent, but to keep themselves anchored, writing for the sake of remembrance. They mention the strange comfort they found in stories of Ooo, how the tales of a human boy and his faithful dog became almost sacred. Tiny sparks of life against the overwhelming hush. They speak with a quiet awe about how even dead universes can remember, and how some stories never truly fade. There is a letter from a realm that fell because it could not reconcile light and darkness. The writer speaks of a sky divided into impossible halves, one ablaze with golden sun, the other draped in endless night. The inhabitants learn to navigate the contrast, to dance between extremes, until eventually the tension unraveled the very foundations of reality. They write of marveling at Oo's balance, at how the world managed to be both wondrous and dangerous, chaotic yet tender, without tearing itself apart. They describe imagining Finn and Jake walking through their world, calming storms with laughter, softening the edges of fear with friendship, and wonder if such harmony could ever have saved them. Another voice surfaces from a universe that ended in quiet implosion, a gentle collapse rather than violence. Entire oceans condensed into crystal orbs, forests folded into themselves like pages of a book, and creatures evaporated into glimmers of memory. The writer explains that they spent the final moments cataloging what remained, naming every mountain, river, and shadow before it faded. Among their lists, they included the memory of Ooo, as though the world itself deserved to be remembered, even if it was never theirs to live in. They write that Finn's courage and Jake's warmth seemed to endure independently of time, floating through the void like distant stars. They wondered if some echoes of their universe might yet brush against others, stitching together fragments of life that had once been whole. One letter comes from a universe that fell because its inhabitants grew too afraid of change. They describe cities abandoned mid-construction, streets left untrodden, and rivers diverted to prevent new life from emerging. The writer was among the few who still dared to dream, documenting memories and imagining stories in secret. They write that they discovered the tales of Ooo as if finding a secret garden hidden in a ruined courtyard. They speak of how the adventures of Finn and Jake provided hope that worlds could embrace both wonder and uncertainty without fear, and how those stories, though originating in another reality, offered guidance for surviving the quiet collapse of their own. Another letter floats from a dead universe where time itself unraveled like a spool of fraying thread. The writer describes moments that stretched into eternities, while other moments vanished before they could be observed. Civilizations rose and fell in a blink, and memory became unreliable, like water slipping through fingers. Yet, amid the instability, stories of Ooo persisted. The writer marvels at the resilience of its adventures, how the essence of heroism and friendship could ripple through even realities that no longer existed. They describe their own attempts to anchor fragments of memory, writing letters that perhaps would never be read, but somehow, against impossibility, did survive. A particularly poetic letter comes from a universe that ended not with fire or ice, but with an overwhelming sense of stillness. The writer speaks of walking across empty plains where shadows lingered without shapes and the wind carried no sound. They describe finding fragments of stories in the dust, faint echoes of laughter, faint impressions of heroic deeds. Among these fragments was a vague recollection of a boy and a dog, and the writer found themselves comforted by this memory, imagining that even as their world disappeared, some trace of life and wonder could persist beyond the end. They write that perhaps all universes, even those that die, leave behind whispers, and those whispers are not lost. They drift, waiting to be found. Another letter drifts in from a universe that was devoured by its own magic, a place where enchantment spiraled beyond control until every object and every being was consumed in a gentle, dissolving light. The writer, a chronicler of the magical arts, watched their world fade while documenting every echo, every shimmer, every resonance left behind. In their final moments, they scribbled notes of Ooo, imagining that perhaps the stories of Finn and Jake had some way of crossing the void between worlds. They wrote not to be saved, not to be remembered, but simply to honor the persistence of wonder, even when all else was gone. The letters continued to arrive, fragile and luminous, carrying the hushed voice of entire worlds that no longer breathe. Each one tells of endings, of silence, of memory persevering against the inevitable. They remind us that even when reality itself dissolves, fragments of existence linger, gentle and quiet, like soft starlight spilling across the edges of night. They speak of the strange solace found in stories, how tales of friendship, courage, and wonder can persist far beyond the collapse of their originating worlds. They whisper that nothing is ever truly gone, because even in death, universes leave behind letters meant for those who are willing to listen. As we continue to drift through these hushed messages from dead universes, we encounter a letter from a place that ended not in fire or collapse, but in quiet resignation. The writer speaks of vast plains where the grass no longer grew, and rivers that had slowed to a barely perceptible shimmer. Mountains once towering now lay flattened, their jagged edges softened by the inexorable passage of nothingness. The inhabitants had disappeared long before the final moment, leaving behind cities that seemed to wait patiently, as if they knew they would never again be walked upon. The letter's author writes that during these last days, they found solace in imagining the vibrancy of Ooo, of a world where laughter and friendship could survive even the most impossible odds. They wonder if, somewhere in the void, the echoes of a boy and his dog might still wander through empty corridors of time, offering comfort to those who remain even as worlds fade. Another letter emerges from a universe that dissolved in waves of crystalline light. In that reality, magic and energy were so abundant that they became uncontrollable, tearing apart landscapes and collapsing entire civilizations with brilliance that was both terrifying and beautiful. The writer, a historian of arcane patterns, recounts the final moments of their world with a detached awe, describing how cities shimmered and folded into themselves, how creatures of unimaginable forms faded into sparks of luminescence. They write that during the last moments, they could sense a harmony in the chaos, a faint resonance that reminded them of Ooo. They imagined Finn and Jake moving through their world, not to fix it, but to offer small gestures of kindness, a wink of courage that might ripple beyond the boundaries of existence itself. One particularly tender letter comes from a universe that ended in stillness, where even thought seemed to slow to a near stop. The writer describes wandering through landscapes of muted color, where skies faded into gray and forests became shadows of memory. They write that even in the absence of life, the world retained faint traces of stories once told, faint echoes of heroism, faint glimmers of joy. Among these remnants, they discovered fragments of tales from Ooo, stories of a boy with a brave heart and a dog with a loyal spirit. They described feeling a strange warmth as they read and reread these stories, as though the tales themselves carried a gentle life force, defying the silence that consumed everything else. They write that these fragments became their companions in the empty world, small sparks that reminded them of beauty even at the end. Another letter comes from a universe that collapsed under the weight of its own complexity. In this reality, every choice branched into countless possibilities until the very fabric of space-time could no longer hold. Civilizations became trapped in loops of their own making, repeating events endlessly. never fully able to move forward or backward. The writer, one of the few conscious observers left, explains that their world became a maze of echoes, a place where every action had already been performed countless times. They write that it was in this labyrinth that they discovered stories of Ooo, tales of simple friendship and bravery that existed outside the entanglements of fate. They speak of how these stories reminded them that even in worlds gone awry, small acts of courage and kindness could resonate, leaving impressions on realities far beyond their own. A letter drifts in from a universe that ended in a gentle implosion, where energy folded inward like the closing of a flower at dusk. The writer speaks of how oceans became still pools of light, of how forests shrank into quiet glimmers, and of how creatures dissolved into reflections of themselves. They write that in the final moments, they turned to stories of Ooo as if to hold on to something that was not theirs but somehow always belonged. They describe imagining Finn and Jake walking through the quiet ruins, offering small smiles and soft laughter that touch the remnants of life. The writer reflects that even in a universe folded into nothingness, the essence of adventure and friendship could linger, drifting gently like a leaf across a forgotten pond. Another message emerges from a dead universe where thought and language began to unravel. The inhabitants could no longer speak without words breaking into fragments, and memory itself became unreliable. The writer recounts walking through deserted cities, reading inscriptions that shifted meaning with every glance. Amidst this uncertainty, they discovered tales of Ooo, which seemed untouched by the unraveling. They describe how the simple, enduring qualities of Finn's bravery and Jake's loyalty offered a strange reassurance, a reminder that some truths exist beyond the fragility of perception. They write that holding on to these stories felt like holding on to sunlight, a gentle warmth that could not be erased even as everything else dissolved. There is a letter from a universe that ended because its inhabitants could not remember how to hope. In that world, despair grew quietly, spreading like a slow fog that dulled senses and muted color. Cities became hollow shells, forests shriveled into gray, and the skies lost their vibrancy. The writer recalls discovering stories of Ooo amidst the decay and feeling a profound shift. They write that even a world steeped in hopelessness could find light in tales of courage, kindness, and companionship. They describe how these stories became small beacons in their memory, a quiet encouragement to imagine possibilities beyond despair. They speak of a boy and his dog who lived only in stories, yet whose spirit seemed to endure far longer than the civilizations around them. Another letter drifts from a universe that ended in endless twilight, where light and shadow intertwined until no clear distinction remained. The writer describes wandering through forests where colors were muted, and rivers were silver threads of reflection. They recount hearing faint hums, the last vibrations of their world, carrying whispers of events long past. Amidst the twilight, they discovered tales of Ooo, of adventures that defied certainty and danger, yet were filled with trust and laughter. They write that these stories seem to pulse with quiet illuminating the dim horizon of their consciousness. They reflect that even in a universe where all seems lost, the memory of friendship and courage can still shine gently like a faraway star. We continue now through the drifting whispers of dead universes, where every letter is a delicate wisp of memory, surviving the quiet collapse of entire realities. One letter comes from a universe that ended in slow reversal, where rivers climbed upward and winds reversed their course, as though the world itself was gently unspooling. The writer speaks from a high plateau where the remnants of their cities shimmer like heat-hazed mirages. They describe walking among structures that had once hummed with life, now silent but still carrying the faint resonance of laughter, the subtle imprint of joy. In the midst of this quiet, they discovered stories of Ooo and of a boy and his dog. They write that these stories felt alive in a way their own universe no longer could, as though adventure and friendship had a power the collapse of worlds could not erase. They carried these stories in their hands, in their heart, as a final companion. Another letter arrives from a universe that dissolved in waves of muted color, where sky and land blended into one continuous gray, and the distinction between day and night had ceased to exist. The writer explains that even though their world had faded, they could still recall textures and sensations, the warmth of sun on grass that no longer grew, the cold of air that no longer moved. Amidst these memories, they wrote of Ooo, of Finn's courage, and Jake's playful loyalty. They describe how these characters became symbols not just of action, but of persistence, proof that even when all else fades, something gentle, brave, and joyful can endure. They write that carrying such stories felt like carrying a small flame in the darkness, a flame that illuminated the vast emptiness of their vanished world. A third letter drifts from a universe that ended in echo. Here, sound itself unraveled, leaving the world muted and hollow. The writer speaks of a final lingering hum, the collective resonance of a civilization slipping into memory. They describe how even in silence, fragments of sound could still convey meaning, like the faint vibration of a string plucked in the void. Among these vibrations, they discovered echoes of Ooo, stories that seemed to resonate through the very emptiness around them. They write that the laughter of a boy and his dog, the quiet courage of a human heart, carried through the void in delicate, fleeting waves, comforting the last conscious mind of a world that had ceased to exist. They felt less alone with these echoes, less swallowed by the stillness. One letter emerges from a universe that ended when its magic folded inward, collapsing entire regions like fabric into tight, silent knots. The writer speaks from a place where landscapes have been compressed into tiny, crystalline forms, each reflecting fragments of what once was. They describe walking through fields of glittering remnants, touching shards that hold the memory of rivers, mountains, and forests. Amidst these fragments, they discovered stories of Ooo, of a boy and his dog, of kingdoms and quests. The letters describe how these stories seemed to breathe despite the collapse, as if they carried a gentle, defiant life that refused to vanish. The writer held these tales close, reading them aloud even when there was no one to hear, because their presence offered a fragile comfort in a universe folded into stillness. Another voice surfaces from a reality that ended in gradual fading, where color drained from landscapes and skies became washed in endless twilight. In this world, time itself seemed to trickle rather than flow, and moments extended beyond measure. The writer recounts walking through long, empty streets where shadows stretched unnaturally and wind had lost its song. Amid the muted tones, they discovered stories of Ooo and found warmth in the descriptions of a boy and his dog wandering through sunlit fields and starlit forests. They write that even in the endless gray, the simple joys of courage and companionship illuminated their mind, like faint glimmers of dawn on the horizon of a world that had ceased to exist. A particularly delicate letter comes from a universe where the inhabitants vanished in waves, leaving entire cities empty as though everyone had gently walked into the distance. The writer recalls wandering through deserted marketplaces and quiet squares, finding scattered remnants of life, a torn page from a journal, a cracked cup, a forgotten toy. Among these relics, they discovered stories of Ooo, tales of adventures that once thrilled the living. They write that these stories were like water flowing into their hands, filling the emptiness with a soft warmth. Even though no one remained to hear, they read aloud, feeling as though Finn and Jake's courage and joy could extend across the void and touch the smallest, quietest corners of existence. Another letter drifts from a universe that ended in reverse entropy, where matter slowly unwove itself until only abstract shapes remained. The writer, a chronicler of forms, describes seeing echoes of life lingering in patterns of energy and light. They discovered stories of Ooo in these abstract echoes, recognizing the essence of adventure, courage, and loyalty even when the words and forms had nearly vanished. They write of feeling a connection to these vanished heroes, as though their virtues transcended matter and time, capable of reaching worlds even after collapse. They held these stories in their mind like a gentle glow, proof that meaning can endure even in the absence of substance. One more letter arrives from a universe that ended not with violence, but with serenity, a soft dissolving of existence into quiet nothingness. The writer speaks of walking through landscapes that had once been vibrant, now pale and almost dreamlike. They describe forests that no longer grew, rivers that reflected nothing, skies that shimmered faintly before fading entirely. Among these remnants, they discovered tales of Ooo, stories that carried warmth and light despite the emptiness. They write that the courage of a boy and the loyalty of his dog seemed to persist independently of the world around them, offering reassurance, companionship, and gentle hope in the quietest moments. These stories became their final solace, a whisper of life in a universe that had already gone silent. We now drift into the final stretch of our journey through the letters from dead universes, where the voices of vanished worlds linger like soft echoes across an endless void. One letter comes from a universe that ended in a slow, almost reverent collapse, where every living thing gently dissolved into light and memory. The writer speaks from what remain, wandering among the echoes of mountains, rivers, and forests. They write of discovering stories of Ooo in the faintest traces of reality, tales of a human boy and his faithful dog whose courage and friendship could transcend worlds. They describe reading these stories as though holding a warm hand in the dark, the gentle pulse of life lingering even as their universe faded into nothingness. Another letter drifts in from a universe consumed by its own relentless expansion, where stars grew too hot, oceans boiled away, and skies cracked with luminous fissures. The writer, a quiet observer who survived only in hidden crevices of reality, writes of standing beneath a broken sky and reading the tales of Ooo as though the words themselves could shield them from the collapse. They describe imagining Finn's bravery, Jake's stretching loyalty, and the gentle wonders of a world that balanced magic and mischief. In those stories, the writer found solace, as if hope itself could reach through the fissures of a dying cosmos and rest for a moment on the heart of one who still remembered. One letter arrives from a universe that ended in silence so profound that even thought seemed to hesitate. The writer describes wandering through empty streets, cities frozen in the moment of their disappearance, wind stilled, rivers motionless. Yet in that stillness they discovered the faint hum of stories from Ooo, carried perhaps on some hidden frequency of reality itself. They write that the tales of Finn and Jake seemed to bloom gently in the quiet, like a single flower opening in a desolate landscape. They speak of holding these stories close, reading and rereading them, letting them act as a compass in a world that had lost all direction. Another voice emerges from a universe that ended in gentle dissonance, where every element once in harmony slowly fell out of tune. Mountains shifted against rivers, stars glimmered with unpredictable rhythm, and forests swayed without order. The writer describes feeling a profound sense of melancholy as their world unraveled. Yet in discovering tales of Ooo, they found patterns that soothed, rhythms that reminded them of balance, friendship, and courage. They write that even if their universe had been incapable of harmony, the essence of these stories persisted, like a soft, unwavering pulse beneath chaos. They imagine Finn and Jake wandering through their fragmented landscapes, leaving behind faint traces of laughter and hope. Another letter comes from a universe that folded in upon itself, where matter and energy compressed until landscapes and beings existed only as fleeting impressions. The writer recounts walking across plains where shadows shimmered like heat on stone and rivers left faint traces in the air. Amid this ephemeral world, they discovered stories of Ooo and describe how the courage of one boy and the loyalty of his dog felt tangible in the palm of their hand. They write that these stories were a kind of gravity, pulling them toward a sense of connection and continuity even as their own world disappeared into abstract nothingness. A letter drifts in from a universe that faded into quiet gray, where even time moved hesitantly, and days bled softly into nights without distinction. The writer explains that, in the absence of movement, they found a strange serenity, yet also profound isolation. They discovered tales of Ooo and wrote that these stories acted like a gentle tide, bring back fleeting colors, sounds, and warmth to a world that had lost them. They describe imagining Finn and Jake moving through this twilight realm, offering reassurance, playful courage, and quiet companionship, the kind that lingers long after footsteps fade. Another voice comes from a universe that ended with gentle implosion, where landscapes folded inward like petals closing, and oceans condensed into pools of refracted light. The writer describes tracing shapes that once were forests, rivers, and cities, feeling the imprint of life that had existed there. They write that in the quiet, they found stories of Ooo and felt a resonance, an enduring vibrancy that neither entropy nor stillness could erase. They imagined Finn's unwavering bravery and Jake's joyful elasticity weaving through these shapes, leaving traces of warmth and wonder that survived the final moments of their world. A particularly poignant letter arrives from a universe that fell into slow entropy, where even memory began to dissolve. The writer describes trying to hold on to everything they knew, the textures of trees, the smells of oceans, the sounds of laughter. But slowly, each detail slipped into abstraction. Yet the stories of Ooo persisted, unyielding to decay. They write that reading about Finn and Jake, about kingdoms of candy, forests of whispers, and adventures without end, filled them with a quiet hope, a feeling that even when all else is lost, the essence of life, friendship, and courage can endure. Another letter drifts in from a universe consumed by shadow, where light retreated to the smallest cracks and every sound was absorbed into darkness. The writer recalls walking through empty plains and hollowed cities, seeing shapes and silhouettes that once carried life. They describe discovering stories of Ooo in fragments, scribbled in scattered books, or whispered across the void in frequencies only the heart could hear. They write that even in their universe's death, the courage, kindness, and laughter of a boy and his dog shone like tiny lanterns in the darkness, guiding them gently through despair and reminding them that some sparks never fade. One final letter for this segment comes from a universe that ended in gentle dissolution, where matter, energy, and even thought folded into a slow, unending twilight. The writer describes how they wandered through the fading landscape, carrying only their memories and the stories they could grasp. They discovered tales of Ooo and felt that the legacy of friendship, bravery, and curiosity could transcend not just their own universe, but all universes yet to be. They write that these stories were a soft lullaby, a quiet, persistent heartbeat against the silence of oblivion, proof that even in death, wonder endures. And so, in the hush of collapsed realities, we realize that nothing ever truly vanishes. Even dead universes leave behind whispers, and these whispers carry the essence of worlds, heroes, and adventures forward, as if reaching through eternity to remind us that life, in its softest, kindest forms, is never lost. They tell us that even silence has a voice, and that voice hums the eternal story of courage, friendship, and the gentle magic of Ooo. As we leave behind the quiet echoes of universes that no longer exist, we drift gently into a world of memories barely remembered, where letters arrive from forgotten characters, beings who once lived in Oo's vibrant tapestry, who played small but significant parts in stories now almost lost to time. These are voices that slipped between the cracks of adventure, whispers that faded beneath the echoes of grand quests and heroic feats, yet whose hearts carried tales worth holding. They are letters sent across the void of forgetting, carried by the faintest currents of magic and memory, arriving now just for us. The first letter comes from a small, unassuming creature who lived on the fringes of the Candy Kingdom. They write that they were never a hero, nor did they wield power or command kingdoms. They were a caretaker of tiny things, a patch of moss on a hill, a family of glow bugs in a hollow log, forgotten paths that twisted beneath flowering vines. They describe watching great events unfold from the quiet of shadows, seeing princes and princesses, adventurers and villains, passing by as if their world were too small to notice. And yet, the letter hums with gentle pride, because they saw Finn and Jake smile at the smallest wonders, pause to listen to whispers of the wind, or kneel beside someone who felt invisible. They write that in those moments, they realized even forgotten souls have meaning, for courage and kindness ripple in ways that escape the eye. Another letter drifts in from a being who once belonged to a village that no longer exists. They were a baker of simple bread, a weaver of cloth, a quiet presence that filled rooms without demanding notice. They recall a day when Finn passed through, laughing as Jake stretched across rooftops, the kind of laughter that could make a town forget its troubles for a moment. The writer describes leaving small gifts for the adventurers, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a scarf stitched with care. They never expected thanks or recognition, yet decades later, they imagine their humble gestures echoing through memory, wondering if the warmth they gave has lingered quietly in the hearts of those who journeyed across the land. They write with a tender humility, reminding us that even small acts leave traces longer than any epic battle. One particularly poetic letter comes from a figure who was once the scribe of a minor kingdom, a place overshadowed by the grandeur of the larger magical realms. They recall chronicling the deeds of heroes whose names everyone remembers, while their own work faded quietly into the background. Yet they write they saw moments of truth in the edges of these tales, the way a single act of loyalty changed a day, the way a kind word softened fear, the way Finn and Jake's friendship illuminated lives in ways too small to be noticed on scrolls and maps. They reflect on the paradox of being forgotten while witnessing greatness, understanding that their letters, though minor, are threads that connect the lives of the overlooked to the grand narrative of Ooo. Another letter comes from a traveler who roamed the edges of the nightosphere, a place both strange and terrifying. They write of creatures who thrived in darkness, whose voices were lost amid roars and whispers of more powerful being. They describe wandering through shadowed streets and echoing caverns, observing the lives of beings who seldom interacted with the wider world. And yet, in quiet corners, They saw moments of bravery and tenderness. A small demon risking comfort to help another. A forgotten soul sharing laughter beneath the starlit expanse. They write that these moments reminded them of Finn and Jake, heroes whose courage extended beyond battles, reaching even those who lived in the margins. They wonder whether, in some unseen way, their stories intertwine, threads of bravery and care forming a pattern too subtle for the eye to see. One letter arrives from a small, timid creature who once guarded the edges of the Fire Kingdom, tending to embers that flickered at the edge of chaos. They write that they never wielded flame in battles, nor were they remembered in songs or tales, but they observed. They saw a flame princess learning, struggling, and forgiving. They watched Finn and Jake navigate the strange, shifting magic of their world, offering kindness where it was needed, even when no one noticed. The letter hums with reverence, not for grand heroics, but for presence, the quiet acts of being there, of noticing, of carrying a small part of the story that might otherwise vanish. They write that even forgotten guardians leave sparks behind, small lights that travel across time. Another letter drifts from a being who lived in the shadows of the Ice Kingdom, a scholar who recorded the migrations of rare frost creatures, cataloging snow patterns and glacial formations. They write that in their solitude, they occasionally glimpse the figures of Finn and Jake moving across frozen plains, heroes whose laughter seemed to carve warmth into the cold. The writer never spoke with them, never left their observations in books read by others, and yet they felt connected. They described the strange, comforting thought that even in forgotten corners of the world, the smallest attention to wonder is a form of participation, a quiet alliance with courage and curiosity. One letter comes from a creature who spent years beneath the roots of a great tree in the outskirts of the Candy Kingdom, tending to the soil, listening to the subtle rhythms of life. They write that while the world above engaged in adventures, battles, and quests, they lived a life measured by the growth of mushrooms, the drift of soil, the slow unfolding of seasons. Yet in moments of solitude, they observed echoes of adventure, traces of Finn's footprints, Jake's stretching shadows, laughter that threaded through leaves. They write that even as someone who seems small and insignificant, their existence intertwined with the grand tapestry of Ooo, and that noticing these echoes is, in itself, a kind of quiet heroism. Another letter comes from a being who once served as a messenger in a faraway kingdom, carrying letters that mapped the daily routines of rulers, knights, and minor heroes. They recount delivering news of great battles, heroic deeds, and celebrations, always in the background, always unrecognized. Yet they write they remember one day when Finn and Jake paused to speak with them, acknowledging their role, offering a small smile that resonated more than any accolade. They describe the memory as luminous, a gentle reminder that recognition need not be loud to endure. The letter reflects on how forgotten characters often shape the texture of worlds, offering subtle guidances and quiet support that allows stories to flourish. A particularly tender letter drifts from a being who once lived near the edges of a magical forest, a guardian of small, fragile creatures, baby birds, lost insects, tiny plants struggling toward sunlight. They write that their life consisted of tiny gestures, helping a fledgling find its nest, mending broken leaves, redirecting streams that might wash away delicate saplings. They never saw themselves as part of larger adventures, yet they recall glimpsing Finn and Jake passing through, curious and gentle, taking time to notice small wonders. The writer hums with quiet pride, knowing that the lives they nurtured were as important as any conquest, and that the memory of care persists even when the world forgets their names. We continue drifting through the soft murmurs of forgotten characters, whose lives brushed against the grand adventures of Ooo in ways so subtle they almost went unnoticed. One letter comes from a humble gardener who tended a small orchard on the outskirts of the Candy Kingdom. They describe rows of candy fruit trees bending under the weight of their sweetness, and the quiet joy of watching them flourish. They write that one day Finn and Jake passed by, laughing and chasing shadows, their joy brushing against the branches. The gardener says that, for a moment, the world seemed to swell with the possibility that the simplest act of noticing life could ripple into warmth far greater than any spell or battle. They close the letter with a gentle reflection. Even small hands that nurture unnoticed can shape the quiet heart of a world. Another letter drifts from a timid creature who lived beneath the roots of the great gum tree. They write that they never sought adventure, preferring to observe quietly as the world shifted above them. Yet they remember glimpsing Finn climbing branches, Jake stretching across canopies, and the way their laughter stirred the wind. The letter speaks of wonder, not in heroic feats, but in presence, how noticing, even from the shadows, allows stories to grow. They describe keeping scraps of cloth, drawings, and faint sounds as mementos, little pieces of a world that might have forgotten them, yet lingered gently and merry. One letter arrives from a forgotten inventor, a small figure who tinkered in hidden workshops on the edges of the Ice Kingdom. They write of creating devices that no one ever saw, marvels meant to aid those who passed silently through their world. The inventor recalls Finn pausing to examine a curious little contraption, Jake sniffing it, stretching to reach its delicate parts. The letter hums with quiet pride, not for recognition, but for the fleeting connection, the moment where worlds intersect, even softly, through attention and curiosity. The inventor writes that these small interactions were enough to make their life meaningful, a soft ripple in a tapestry of larger tales. Another voice comes from a timid librarian who tended dusty volumes in a forgotten tower, cataloging the stories of minor heroes and overlooked realms. They write that their days were long and quiet, yet occasionally Finn and Jake would appear, seeking knowledge, listening to stories, asking questions with earnest hearts. The librarian writes of the strange warmth that arose in those moments, when attention itself became a kind of adventure. They reflect on the paradox of being forgotten, yet participating in stories that endure, noting that the act of observing, remembering, and quietly nurturing knowledge is itself a form of heroism. A particularly reflective letter comes from a creature who spent their life caring for wounded animals across the borders of the Fire Kingdom. They write of tending to scorched forests and injured creatures, often unnoticed by the wider world. They recall a day when Finn and Jake passed through, offering gentle words and help to those in need, and how their presence mirrored the same small kindness the writer extended to creatures daily. The letter hums with the understanding that courage and compassion do not need recognition to matter, that the smallest acts leave ripples in the hearts of worlds, shaping them quietly, invisibly, but meaningfully. Another letter drifts from a solitary musician who once played simple tunes in quiet squares, far from the grandeur of royal courts or heroes' feasts. They write that their melodies rarely carried beyond the ears of a few passers-by. Yet one day Finn stopped to listen, Jake lying beside him in the sun, tail lazily twitching. The musician describes the fleeting warmth of acknowledgement, how a small smile can echo far longer than fame or accolade. They write that music, like memory and courage, can linger softly, touching lives in unexpected ways, a quiet thread connecting forgotten souls to the wider tapestry of Ooo. A letter comes from a baker who once provided sustenance to wandering adventurers, who filled backpacks with bread and cakes, never expecting thanks. They recall moments when Finn and Jake paused, sharing a bite and offering a nod of appreciation. The letter hums with gentle pride, noting that the world is shaped not only by heroic acts, but by the small gestures of care that sustain life, laughter, and friendship in ways that outlast battles and conquests. One letter drifts from a creature who lived among the ruins of a forgotten village, tending the gardens, repairing fences, and listening to the whispers of wind across empty streets. They write of glimpsing the footprints of heroes long gone, of shadows passing silently over stone and soil. Yet they remember Finn's laughter and Jake's playful bark, echoes that seem to linger even when the figures themselves had vanished. The writer hums with quiet joy, recognizing that their own attention, their own small acts of care, allowed these echoes to be noticed, preserved, and gently passed along. Another letter comes from a modest healer who once tended to minor injuries, calming fears with a soft touch and kind word. They recount treating adventurers and wanderers alike, never expecting recognition. Yet they remember the day Finn returned from a skirmish, scratched and tired, and Jake stretching beside him. They write that a simple acknowledgement, a nod, a smile, a word of thanks, carried a resonance far greater than fame or fortune. The letter reflects on the gentle truth that forgotten characters are the quiet backbone of worlds, preserving the rhythm of life, the pulse of kindness, and the subtle harmony upon which stories rest. We continue to drift through these tender letters, voices of forgotten characters whose lives touched Ooo in ways so gentle they almost went unnoticed. One letter comes from a humble herbalist who lived in a hidden glade at the edge of the enchanted forest. They write of tending rare flowers and plants that could heal or soothe, sometimes barely recognized by anyone passing through. They recall one day when Finn and Jake wandered into the glade, curious about the colors, the scents, and the soft, rustling leaves. The herbalist writes that the adventurers paused to admire the petals, to ask about each plant, and that their attention, their wonder, became a bridge between worlds. They reflect that even small acts of noticing, of listening, can give a sense of permanence to things otherwise overlooked. Another letter drifts from a creature who spent their days mending worn shoes and worn hearts in a little village tucked between hills. They describe watching travelers come and go, many unaware of their presence, yet leaving traces of gratitude that drifted like seeds in the wind. They remember Finn and Jake walking through, laughing and joking, and how the smallest acknowledgement, a smile, a nod, a gentle thank you, felt like a spark igniting warmth in the quietest corners of the world. The writer writes that they never sought recognition, yet the memory of being seen by heroes felt like a quiet testament to the power of gentle interaction. One letter comes from a forgotten scout who explored dangerous paths that few dared to tread, a silent observer of nature's moods and the hidden rhythms of Ooo. They write of carrying messages between kingdoms, of recording signs of subtle change in forests and mountains, and of the silent understanding that life, even when unnoticed, matters. They recall glimpsing Finn and Jake on distant hills, their laughter trailing like soft ribbons across valleys. The scout reflects that even forgotten eyes have the capacity to witness and preserve the beauty of heroism, that noticing is itself a quiet act of courage. Another letter drifts in from a being who once guided lost travelers across the shifting sands of a desert that appears only at certain times in the year. They write of nights spent under open skies, listening to the wind and counting stars, marking paths no one else could see. They remember a time when Finn and Jake arrived unexpectedly, weary yet light-hearted, and how their presence seemed to illuminate the dunes with laughter and purpose. The letter hums with quiet reverence, noting that even the smallest acts of guidance, showing a path, pointing toward safety, can ripple through lives, leaving traces far longer than battles or grand gestures. A particularly delicate letter comes from a seamstress in a distant town who crafted garments for travelers, adventurers, and wanderers. They recall stitching cloaks for those who passed through in haste, never expecting recognition. Yet they remember a moment when Finn returned to adjust a cloak, Jake stretching beside him, and how the small gesture of care, both from the adventurers and themselves, created a silent bond that lingered across time. They write that even forgotten hands and unnoticed efforts contribute quietly to the fabric of stories, shaping worlds gently, invisibly, yet indelibly. Another letter drifts from a creature who lived in the shadow of the Ice King's fortress, a timid soul who often avoided notice, yet watched the world with quiet curiosity. They recall moments when Finn and Jake passed by, navigating treacherous ice paths, offering kindness to those who were otherwise overlooked. The letter hums with gentle pride, noting that being forgotten does not equate to insignificance. Witnessing acts of courage and kindness, even silently, allows these forgotten characters to participate in the greater story, their memory preserved in the smallest of moments. One letter comes from a gardener of the nightosphere, tending to plants that thrived only in faint moonlight and shadow. They write of the quiet beauty and tending life that exists at the edges, invisible to the hurried and loud. They recall seeing Finn and Jake moving through realms of shadow, noticing details, interacting with life others overlook. They reflect that even those who live unseen hold worlds together through attention, care, and small acts of tenderness, and that such contributions endure quietly like roots beneath the soil, shaping the life that flourishes above. Another letter drifts from a minor alchemist who experimented with tiny potions that never reached fame, yet contained subtle magic capable of healing or calming. They write of Finn stopping by to ask about a curious concoction, Jake sniffing and pawing at vials, and the warmth of simple acknowledgement. They describe feeling that the smallest forms of creativity, unnoticed though they may be, ripple gently through the lives of others. The letter emphasizes that forgotten characters, like overlooked ingredients, are essential to the alchemy of life, shaping worlds quietly, yet profoundly. A tender letter comes from a small, elderly figure who once guarded a library in a distant hilltop, cataloging minor histories and overlooked events. They write that their days passed in quiet reflection until Finn and Jake arrived, seeking tales that had slipped between the cracks of memory. They describe feeling a profound, gentle connection, knowing that even forgotten knowledge matters, and that stories preserved quietly in the margins can touch lives, inform courage, and inspire kindness in ways grander deeds sometimes cannot. One more letter drifts from a creature who tended rivers and streams in forgotten valleys, ensuring that life continued in subtle ways. They write that while no one noticed their care, the creatures, plants, and hidden life flourished quietly. They recall a day when Finn and Jake paused by a riverbank, watching the water sparkle, and how their presence brought attention to the life that often goes unseen. The letter hums with quiet joy, reflecting on how even unnoticed efforts have enduring impact, and that the lives of forgotten characters are interwoven with every story that survives. We now drift into the final stretch of letters from forgotten characters, where the whispers of quiet lives carry the soft, enduring heartbeat of Ooo. One letter arrives from a caretaker of a small grove, where luminous flowers opened only under moonlight. They write that no one came to visit, yet they tended each petal and leaf as if the world depended upon it. They recall a night when Finn and Jake wandered through, their laughter spilling softly among the glowing flora. The caretaker describes how their presence, though brief, brought warmth to the grove, a reminder that even forgotten corners of the world could experience a gentle brush of joy. They reflect that being remembered is not the measure of impact. Attention, kindness, and care can resonate silently, echoing through time in ways unseen. Another letter drifts from a humble mapmaker, someone who charted the hidden valleys, winding rivers, and shifting landscapes that many travelers overlooked. They recount days spent in solitude, tracing paths with ink and paper, feeling that each line captured the heartbeat of the land itself. One day, Finn paused to examine the maps, Jake stretching beside him, and their curiosity and wonder transformed the act of mapping into something shared, alive. The writer hums with quiet pride, noting that even unnoticed labor, recording the quiet rhythms of the world, can ripple outward when met with attention, creating moments of connection that endure far longer than the ink itself. A particularly tender letter comes from a creature who once cleaned and polished the armor of minor warriors, preparing them for battles that no songs would remember. They describe how the small details, the polishing of a helm, the straightening of a strap, felt insignificant at the time. Yet they recall seeing Finn's eyes light up when noticing the care and craftsmanship, Jake wagging beside him. They write that even small, unseen acts of service hold quiet magic, and that the strength of a world relies as much on those who maintain it as on those who fight for it. Another letter drifts in from a quiet cook in a distant tavern, who fed travelers and wanderers with hearty meals and gentle conversation. They write of watching Finn and Jake pass through, laughing and sharing tales, and how the simple act of providing nourishment, warm bread, spiced tea, a listening ear, left an imprint in the memory of those heroes. The writer reflects that forgotten lives are stitched into the fabric of Ooo not with grand gestures, but through subtle acts that shape courage, friendship, and hope in ways often unseen, yet enduring. One letter comes from a night watchman of a small, overlooked town who observed the world under the soft light of stars and lanterns. They write that they rarely spoke to anyone, yet they observed life unfolding, the delicate interactions that defined it. They remember seeing Finn and Jake passing through the town, their presence illuminating paths, offering gentle encouragement, reminding even the smallest citizens that their lives mattered. The letter hums with quiet reflection, suggesting that forgotten characters are guardians not only of places, but of the subtle warmth that sustains life, the unnoticed threads holding stories together. Another letter drifts from a quiet scholar who spent years cataloging the songs of birds, insects, and the soft winds and valleys untouched by adventure. They write that their work seemed invisible, yet it preserved rhythms that allowed life to thrive, unnoticed but essential. One day Finn paused in a meadow listening, and Jake twined around him, playful and curious. The scholar writes that in that moment, even forgotten work became a part of living history, a bridge connecting quiet devotion to the adventures that shape hearts and worlds. A letter comes from a small clockmaker in the fringes of a distant town, whose work measured time quietly, precisely, without notice. They describe how Finn and Jake paused one day to watch the intricacies of gears and pendulums, marveling at the delicate movement. The clockmaker writes that even unnoticed work, small as it may seem, carries meaning and touches lives unexpectedly. They reflect that forgotten characters, like hidden gears, maintain the rhythm of worlds, allowing stories to unfold smoothly, even when their contribution is unseen. One letter drifts from a humble bridge keeper who watched rivers flow beneath planks and stone, ensuring safe passage for those who traveled through. They describe seeing Finn and Jake cross one morning, pausing to toss pebbles into the flowing water, smiling at the shimmer of sunlight. The bridge keeper writes that quiet service, maintaining paths and connections, shapes adventures as much as the heroes themselves. Even when forgotten, these acts remain embedded in the world, guiding those who come after with subtle care. Another letter comes from a gardener of forgotten statues in a quiet courtyard who swept leaves, polished stone, and whispered to carved faces when no one was around. They recall a day when Finn leaned on a statue, laughing with Jake beside him, the weight of the moment folding gently into memory. They write that even overlooked guardians preserve beauty, courage, and reflection, giving heroes and wanderers places to pause, contemplate, and rest. Forgotten characters in this way are keepers of the quiet spaces where stories breathe. A particularly gentle letter drifts from a minor musician who played soft tunes along deserted paths and quiet plazas. They write that they were rarely heard, yet on rare occasions, Finn and Jake paused to listen, allowing the music to ripple outward. The musician reflects that forgotten souls, through subtle harmonies and unnoticed gestures, shape the emotional landscape of worlds. Their presence may not be recorded in history, yet it endures in the hearts of those who notice, becoming an invisible thread of courage, joy, and hope. One final letter for this segment comes from a quiet caretaker of a sun-dappled glen where seedlings pushed through soil and small animals played among wildflowers. They write that even in solitude, their attentiveness preserved life and beauty, a soft, sustaining pulse in the world. They recall Finn and Jake pausing, marveling at the tiny details, laughing at the antics of woodland creatures. The letter hums with reflection. Even the most forgotten lives leave traces, gentle ripples that persist long after names are lost, reminding us that the quiet, unnoticed contributions of the world are as vital as the grandest heroics. And so the letters of forgotten characters reach us, whispering of lives lived in quiet attention, subtle courage, and gentle care. They remind us that even the smallest, unnoticed souls leave ripples across time and space, shaping the rhythm of Ooo, supporting adventures, laughter, and hope in ways no one can ever fully measure. Their voices, though seldom heard, resonate softly through the hearts of those who remember, teaching that every life, even one unnoticed, carries profound significance. As the soft glow of memory and forgotten voices fades, we drift into a new kind of letter, one that comes not from distant lands or unseen corners, but from versions of a boy we know so well, letters from alternate Finns. These are not the Finns we see wandering the familiar landscapes of Ooo, laughing beside Jake or facing danger with courage. These are Finns shaped by worlds that veered differently, by choices that diverged, by challenges that never crossed the paths of the stories we know. Their letters arrive like gentle echoes through parallel timelines, each voice familiar yet subtly, profoundly altered by circumstance and fate. The first letter arrives from a Finn who grew up in a world where adventure was scarce and danger was often absent. In this timeline, kingdoms were peaceful. Monsters lived in quiet forests rather than wandering into towns, and magic was a muted whisper. The Finn of this world writes with a soft melancholy, recalling days spent in contemplation, observing life that moves slowly, almost too slowly, to notice the urgency of heroism. He writes of longing to feel the thrill of challenge, the heartbeat of risk, yet also of a deep appreciation for the quiet beauty of everyday life. The way sunlight glints across a river, the soft rustle of leaves, the unhurried laughter of friends. He wonders what the Finn we know would make of his calm, measured world, and whether courage is only truly courage when it is tested. Another letter comes from a Finn who grew up in a harsh, post-apocalyptic Ooo, a world of ruins and lingering shadows. This Finn writes with a quiet intensity, his words etched with the sharpness of survival. He describes scavenging through collapsed kingdoms, reading inscriptions that tell of past glories, encountering remnants of heroes long gone. He recalls moments of fleeting companionship with other survivors and the small joys that kept him moving: a shared piece of food, the warmth of a small fire, the laughter of someone who dared to smile despite everything. His letter reflects a perspective shaped by endurance and quiet resilience, a Finn who learned courage not in playful quests or grand heroics, but in persistence, in holding on to hope when nothing else remains. One letter drifts from a Finn who never left his home. In this world he grew up in isolation, the wild lands of Ooo largely unexplored, the adventures of heroes merely stories whispered through the trees. This Finn writes with a kind of contemplative wonder, pondering the lives of those who venture outward, imagining the breadth of worlds beyond his own small garden, forest, or village. He reflects on courage as a form of curiosity, of venturing inward as well as outward, of discovering not just lands and monsters, but the depths of one's own heart. His words carry a quiet longing, a soft ache for connection and experience, yet also a profound appreciation for stillness, for the richness of observing life from a place of contemplation. Another letter arrives from a Finn whose life was shaped by loss early and sharply. In this world, he never knew the safety of friends beside him for long, losing companions to strange twists of fate and time. His letter carries a soft weight, a gentle gravity, yet not bitterness. He writes of the tenderness found in fleeting connections, of small joys that become precious because they are ephemeral. He reflects on how courage is often about continuing, about facing each day with a heart that can hope again despite absence, and how even in loss one can leave traces of care, kindness, and bravery. This Finn's letter hums with quiet wisdom, the kind gained not from triumph, but from enduring the fragile beauty of impermanent life. One letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world dominated by magic that was unpredictable, overwhelming, and sometimes cruel. In his reality, spells misfired, enchanted creatures wandered unchecked, and the rules of reality bent in ways that made even the familiar feel strange. He writes with a calm awe, describing how he learned to navigate the shifting world, how bravery became a measured, deliberate practice rather than a spontaneous leap. He reflects on his admiration for Finns who could move freely through such chaos, who could bring joy and friendship into the unpredictable, and how he learned to find small islands of stability and kindness amid the swirling unpredictability. Another letter comes from a Finn whose Ooo was ruled by tyrants, where kingdoms were walled, monsters hunted relentlessly, and trust was a scarce commodity. This Finn writes softly about learning to navigate fear with quiet resolve, about small gestures that mattered more than any grand deeds, about the ways courage manifests in diplomacy, in compassion, and in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. He reflects that heroism is not only measured by the battles won or the dragon slain, but by persistence in doing what is right when the world offers no encouragement. His letter hums with subtle, reflective bravery, a courage shaped not by spectacle, but by careful, deliberate choice. A particularly tender letter drifts from a Finn who grew up alongside Jake, but in a timeline where their bond was tested differently. In this world, Jake's magic was weaker, less reliable, and their adventures were often tinged with struggle and uncertainty. This Finn writes of learning patience, of finding strength in partnership, and of understanding that loyalty is not always measured by success, but by presence and endurance. He writes of quiet evenings where they shared stories, watched sunsets, and understood the importance of being there, even when the world seemed unwilling to cooperate. His words hum with the intimacy of shared experience, the gentle weight of friendship, that persists even under strain. Another letter comes from a Finn who grew up in a world where he was celebrated as a hero from a young age, where every choice seemed predetermined by expectation. This Finn writes softly of the strange solitude of being recognized, of the pressure of always being observed, and of learning that courage sometimes lies in moments of quiet rebellion, in choosing kindness over spectacle, in forging one's own path beneath the weight of expectation. He writes of longing to meet Finns who carved their own stories in less certain worlds, to understand how heroism feels when it is not demanded but chosen freely. One letter drifts from a Finn who grew up surrounded by monsters rather than friends, where trust was a rare commodity and danger was constant. He writes with a quiet awareness, describing how he learned to measure courage carefully, to find the subtle joy in tiny moments of connection, and to recognize that bravery is not only confronting monsters, but forming bonds despite fear. He reflects that even Finns shaped by hardship can carry tenderness, humor, and hope, and that these qualities, though quieter, shine as brightly as the boldest deeds. Another letter arrives from a Finn who grew up in a timeline where the land of Ooo was endlessly sunny, where challenges were gentle and life flowed predictably. He writes with a calm wonder, reflecting on the subtlety of adventure in simplicity, the courage it takes to notice beauty and joy in a world without immediate threats, and the quiet strength of appreciating life's rhythms. He wonders if Finns from harsher worlds could understand the courage in choosing to find meaning in ease, in cultivating joy, and in embracing the soft light that touches every moment. We continue gently through the letters of alternate Finns, voices shaped by worlds both familiar and strange, where the measure of courage and kindness shifts with circumstance. One letter comes from a Finn who grew up in a timeline where magic had vanished entirely. In this world, the skies were clear but ordinary. Forests lacked enchantment, and rivers flowed without shimmer. This Finn writes with quiet curiosity, describing how he learned to find wonder in subtle ways, the song of wind through leaves, the patterns of clouds, the soft glow of dawn over a sleepy village. He reflects that even without dragons or spells, bravery and adventure exist in observing, questioning, and caring, and that the spirit of heroism can bloom even in mundane landscapes. Another letter drifts from a Finn who was raised in a world governed by strict order, where rules were absolute and creativity was discouraged. He writes of learning to navigate a rigid society, finding moments of kindness and laughter in cracks of constraint. He recalls hearing tales of other Finns from worlds of freedom and chaos, imagining how courage feels when it can take any form, when it is not measured by obedience or protocol. His letter hums with the gentle awareness that heroism is not always loud, that even in worlds of structure, small acts of compassion, curiosity, and quiet rebellion can ripple through hearts and shape the fabric of a world. One letter comes from a Finn whose timeline was shaped by isolation, where his only companion was a mirror image of himself, an alternate Jake. They wrote letters to one another, sharing thoughts, fears, and dreams that had no audience beyond themselves. He reflects on the strange intimacy of correspondence, of knowing another who truly understands, even if that other is a reflection. He writes that courage sometimes resides in confronting oneself, in listening and responding to one's own heart, and in nurturing hope when no one else bears witness. Another letter drifts in from a Finn who lived in a world dominated by endless storms, where lightning split the skies and winds howled through valleys. He describes learning to move with patience and precision, to respect the power of nature, and to seek moments of calm amid chaos. He recalls imagining the Finns of quieter worlds, wondering how they experience courage when the threat is subtle rather than constant. His letter hums with soft understanding that bravery adapts to circumstance, that heroism can be gentle or fierce depending on what the world demands, and that resilience is often hidden in quiet survival. A particularly reflective letter comes from a Finn who grew up as a bard, traveling across kingdoms and telling stories rather than wielding swords. He writes of observing other Finns, marveling at their deeds, yet finding his own courage in storytelling. He hums with quiet joy as he describes weaving laughter, wisdom, and hope into songs, passing courage to those who hear him. His letter reminds us that heroism is not solely measured by feats of arms, but by the way stories, songs, and words can touch hearts and preserve courage across time and space. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a shadowed world where most had forgotten the laughter and light of Ooo. He writes of wandering among ruins, yet finding traces of other Finns' adventures in whispers, inscriptions, and memories carried in hidden places. He reflects on how even unseen and unnoticed acts of bravery, compassion, or humor ripple through timelines, reaching him in moments of quiet revelation. He writes that alternate Finns, though scattered across realities, are bound by the persistent thread of hope and courage, invisible but enduring, like stars beyond the clouds. One letter comes from a Finn whose world had long been at peace, yet the tranquility brought its own challenge, the fear of stagnation, of purpose lost. He writes that courage in his world is measured in the willingness to explore the unknown, to ask questions, to challenge complacency gently. He reflects on the bravery in curiosity, in noticing small wonders, and in finding meaning in moments that others might dismiss as ordinary. His letter hums with calm wisdom, a quiet reminder that even in peaceful worlds, courage finds ways to express itself. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world where he was both hero and villain in alternating cycles, where choices reshaped his destiny each day. He writes softly of learning empathy, reflection, and the weight of actions. He reflects that heroism is not a constant state, but a series of choices, and that courage often appears in doing what is right when the world tilts toward chaos. His words hum with complexity, the quiet awareness that even Finns of light carry shadows, and that alternate lives offer perspectives on balance, morality, and resilience. A letter arrives from a Finn who grew up entirely underground, where caves glimmered with crystals and hidden creatures thrived in darkness. He writes of learning to navigate unseen worlds, of finding beauty in dim spaces, and of discovering courage in the quiet act of exploration. He recalls hearing faint echoes of other Finns' adventures in distant lands, imagining their laughter and bravery and how it reaches across dimensions. He hums that courage is often a matter of perception, of finding light and hope even when the world seems enveloped in shadow. One final letter for this first section comes from a Finn who existed in a world where time moved irregularly, where moments stretched and contracted unpredictably. He writes of learning patience, presence, and reflection, observing events unfold in ways impossible to predict. He reflects on the importance of noticing patterns, of being gentle with oneself, and of understanding that bravery often lies in enduring, observing, and acting with intention when the opportunity arises. His letter hums with the quiet acceptance, a reminder that courage is adaptable, shaped not only by challenges but by the flow of time itself. We continue our drift through the soft, meandering letters of alternate Finns, voices shaped by choices, circumstance, and worlds that branch differently. One letter comes from a Finn who grew up in a world where Jake never existed, where the companionship he took for granted was replaced by solitude and the company of distant, fleeting friends. He writes of learning courage in silence, of forming bonds cautiously, and of discovering joy in small connections that might seem insignificant to an outside observer. He hums softly with wonder, imagining how the presence of a steadfast friend changes the shape of adventure, and how absence shapes resilience and self-reliance in ways the familiar Finn could scarcely understand. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world where the Lich was never defeated, where darkness and decay quietly pervaded the land. He writes with a measured calm, describing the subtle courage required to keep moving, to nurture life and kindness even as shadows crept across kingdoms. He reflects on the lessons of endurance, on discovering that bravery is not always about defeating a great evil, but sometimes about protecting what remains, preserving hope and warmth in small, flickering ways. He hums with a gentle reverence for those who live in worlds that test the heart more than the body. One letter arrives from a Finn who grew up in a land where magic was alive but capricious, where spells might heal or harm, and enchantments often shifted without warning. He writes of the careful observation, patience, and subtle understanding required to navigate a world that could never be fully predicted. He recalls moments where he glimpsed heroes from other timelines, their laughter and triumphs carried faintly across the currents of possibility, offering guidance without presence. His letter hums with the quiet wisdom that courage often grows in understanding, in patience, and in gentle attention to the shifting tides of life and magic. Another letter drifts in from a Finn who was raised in a world dominated by sentient machines, where kingdoms were constructed of metal and innovation was survival. He writes softly of learning courage in innovation, in problem-solving, and in balancing logic with heart. He describes small acts of kindness in a world that prizes efficiency over emotion, moments of connection that sustain him even when the land seems cold. He hums with gentle awe at the heroism of those who carry empathy into unfeeling spaces, finding warmth where the world offers none. A particularly tender letter comes from a Finn who existed in a world where Ooo was submerged beneath the water, where islands floated and oceans held the stories of forgotten civilizations. He writes of exploring coral palaces, meeting aquatic creatures, and learning to navigate currents both literal and metaphorical. He reflects on courage as adaptability, as the ability to move with change rather than against it, and on friendship as a lifeline even when forms differ, and words are replaced with gestures, bubbles, and quiet resonance. He hums with reverent appreciation for the resilience of life, even beneath the tides. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world overrun with candy corruption, where the sweetness of the land was tainted, and creatures were both familiar and strange. He writes softly of navigating temptation and deceit, of learning discernment and caution, and of discovering courage in moments of clarity and integrity. He reflects that heroism often appears not in spectacle, but in the quiet choice to do right when all else tempts surrender, to nurture rather than consume, and to honor the sweetness of life without succumbing to its dangers. One letter comes from a Finn who grew up in a world where he never found his sword, where adventure was possible but never immediate, and challenges were met with wit and patience rather than strength. He writes of discovering courage in creativity and improvisation, and in embracing the unknown without fear. He hums with a quiet amusement, imagining other Finns wielding swords, charging boldly while he learned to wield patience, perception, and gentle determination as his own forms of power. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world where he and Jake were separated by impossible distances, where they communicated only through faint signals, letters, and fleeting visions. He writes of longing and hope, of the courage required to maintain connection across vast divides, and of the profound power of trust and love despite absence. He reflects on how friendship, even when tested by circumstance, is a compass, a source of guidance and warmth, and a quiet kind of heroism that endures without recognition. A letter arrives from a Finn who existed in a world where kingdoms were perpetually at war, and victory was never certain. He writes softly of learning courage not only in battle, but in negotiation, in understanding, in seeking peace amid chaos. He hums with reflective reverence for the subtler arts of heroism, those acts that do not earn songs or stories, but preserve lives and honor even when the drums of war beat steadily. He writes that alternate Finns carry wisdom gleaned from circumstance, and that each world's challenges shape courage in different, equally valid forms. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world where monsters were teachers, where fear was guidance, and where the line between friend and foe blurred. He writes with gentle reverence for lessons learned through confrontation, observation, and empathy. He hums softly, reflecting that heroism is not always outward and grand. It is often an internal cultivation of understanding, patience, and the courage to face what is difficult without destroying it, a quiet harmony between strength and compassion. One final letter in this section comes from a Finn who lived in a world where Ooo had healed from countless calamities, where balance was restored and yet complacency had settled. He writes of learning courage and vigilance, of keeping curiosity alive, and of remembering that even peace demands attention, care, and gentle stewardship. He hums with reflective calm, noting that alternate Finns, through their varied experiences, teach us that courage, resilience, and kindness adapt to circumstance, and that every path, no matter how divergent, carries the same essential heartbeat of heroism. We now drift toward the close of letters from alternate Finns, where the voices of these varied realities mingle like soft winds across the multiverse, each carrying wisdom, longing, and gentle reflection. One letter comes from a Finn who grew up in a world of eternal twilight, where the sun neither rose fully nor set completely. Shadows stretched long across silent valleys, and the rhythm of time felt suspended. He writes of learning to notice subtle shifts, the faint sparkle of a dew-laden leaf, the soft rustle of unseen creatures, and how courage for him was quiet attentiveness, the ability to act gently yet decisively when moments demanded it. He hums with reverent calm, reflecting that heroism is sometimes the softest persistence, the careful tending of life when the world seems paused between light and dark. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world where dragons ruled the skies, majestic and intimidating, and the land beneath bore their weight in scars and magic. He writes softly of learning courage through observation and understanding rather than conquest. He reflects on how bravery can be the quiet willingness to coexist, to respect power beyond oneself, and to find harmony where others might only see conflict. He hums with soft awe at the subtleties of strength, noting that even Finns who wield swords with ease can learn from worlds that demand patience, perception, and humility. One letter comes from a Finn who was born into a world where every decision branched into infinite paths simultaneously, a life of constant choice and perpetual reflection. He writes of learning to carry both possibilities and consequences in his heart, to move with intention despite the weight of what could be. He reflects that courage is often measured not in action alone, but in the ability to choose, to embrace uncertainty, and to honor the ripple of impact that extends from even the smallest decision. He hums gently, imagining other Finns who live more linearly, and wonders how different choices might be if all were aware of the echoes that follow each step. Another letter drifts in from a Finn whose world was a mirror of ours, yet inverted, where laughter was shadowed and danger often carried hidden delight. He writes softly of learning to discern joy amid peril, to celebrate life in the smallest victories, and to cherish connections that might vanish tomorrow. He hums with reflective calm, noting that heroism can be playful as well as fierce, and that courage sometimes manifests as the simple decision to smile, to hope, and to act with a gentle resolve when the world seems unkind. A particularly tender letter comes from a Finn who existed in a reality where he never grew old, where time was suspended in the soft liminality between childhood and adulthood. He writes of watching friends age, kingdoms rise and fall, and yet holding steady in a state of perpetual wonder. He hums with quiet contemplation, reflecting that bravery is sometimes the patience to observe change without interference, to cherish fleeting moments, and to understand that even timeless existence carries the weight of choices and connections. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world dominated by endless forests, where civilization barely touched the soil and the wild ruled with subtle order. He writes of learning courage in exploration, in discovering hidden nooks of life, and in understanding that bravery often resides in humility, observation, and respect for the forces that shape a living world. He hums softly, reflecting on how even Finns accustomed to kingdoms, roads, and battles can learn from those whose adventures are quieter, more intimate, and profoundly attuned to the rhythms of life itself. One letter comes from a Finn whose timeline was stitched from moments of joy and grief in equal measure, where laughter and sorrow were inseparable companions. He writes softly of learning courage in balancing these currents, in embracing impermanence, and in finding serenity in acceptance. He hums with a gentle reflection, noting that heroism is often the quiet act of standing steady amidst emotional tides, of maintaining hope and empathy even when the world shifts unpredictably. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world where friendship itself was a challenge, where trust was rare and bonds were fragile. He writes of learning courage in connection, of the subtle bravery in offering kindness when rejection is likely, and of the enduring power of small gestures of loyalty, understanding, and patience. He hums softly, reflecting on how even fleeting connections can ripple outward, shaping worlds and hearts in ways unseen yet profoundly felt. A letter arrives from a Finn who existed in a world where the land of Ooo had never been unified, where kingdoms were isolated and cultures rarely met. He writes of learning courage through diplomacy, observation, and listening rather than combat. He hums gently, noting that heroism is not always about slaying monsters or winning battles, but about nurturing understanding, patience, and quiet wisdom in fractured worlds. His reflections remind us that bravery is adaptive, and that the essence of heroism resides in the choices we make, however subtle, to preserve life and harmony. Another letter drifts from a Finn who grew up in a world where laughter had faded, where songs were few, and joy had become rare. He writes of discovering courage in small acts of levity, of creating fleeting moments of happiness, despite pervasive gloom. He hums with soft pride, noting that heroism often resides in persistence, in the subtle effort to kindle hope and light in darkened corners, and that even Finns from worlds of despair contribute profoundly to the shared multiverse of experience and memory. One final letter for this segment comes from a Finn who exists in a world where all versions of Ooo converge in quiet harmony, where every choice, every path, Every alternate self is acknowledged and remembered. He writes softly of observing the echoes of other Finns, learning from their successes, failures, joys, and sorrows. He hums with a quiet reverence, reflecting that courage, kindness, and curiosity are threads that connect all worlds, that heroism takes infinite forms, and that even the smallest choice made with care resonates across dimensions, shaping the tapestry of possibility. He closes his letter with a gentle thought, a whisper of calm wisdom. Every Finn, in every world, carries within him the capacity to leave traces of hope, courage, and gentle light that endure beyond time, space, and circumstance. As our journey drifts further from the familiar contours of Ooo, we begin to receive letters from entities far beyond the scope of mortal eyes. These are beings who dwell in spaces that fold time and memory into strange shapes, creatures whose consciousness stretches across galaxies, whose understanding of life, loss, and possibility dwarfs the small concerns of kingdoms and adventurers. Their letters arrive like echoes through the void, shimmering with vastness, yet carrying a resonance that touches even the most intimate corners of the heart. The first letter comes from a being who claims to have witnessed the birth of stars long before the first kingdoms of Ooo took shape. They write with a calm, deliberate rhythm, describing the slow dance of cosmic dust, the subtle hum of creation vibrating through the void. They speak of observing countless worlds, each with its own pulse and cadence, and of the faint joy in noticing the rise of heroes and the laughter of children, even on planets as distant as Ooo. Their words hum with quiet awe, noting that while universes are immense, small acts of courage and kindness ripple outward in ways that can reach even the most distant corners of reality. Another letter drifts from a being who exists in the interstitial spaces between timelines, who observes potentialities rather than events, and probabilities rather than certainties. They write softly of the delicate threads that connect cause and effect, noting that even the smallest actions of a hero like Finn can alter the course of countless realities. They describe the subtle interplay of decisions and chance, and how courage is not only about grand gestures, but about the consistent choices made in quiet moments. Their letter hums with reflective wisdom, reminding us that the echoes of our actions stretch farther than we can perceive, touching lives, worlds, and destinies we may never encounter directly. One letter comes from a cosmic entity who inhabits the spaces between thought and memory, who whispers to minds that are open to wonder. They write of the delicate architecture of dreams, of how the stories of Ooo unfold like constellations in a vast mental sky. They reflect on the quiet heroism of noticing, of preserving memory, and of nurturing understanding in those who may otherwise forget. They hum softly about the ways heroes carry traces of cosmic insight, whether in the choices they make, the friends they keep, or the laughter they share. They remind us that even entities of incomprehensible scale are moved by the small, tender acts of life. Another letter drifts from a being who has existed since the collapse of dead universes, who has watched stars wink out and kingdoms fade into silence. They write with a measured, calm gravity, describing the resonance of absence, the quiet echo of lives that once flourished. Yet within this void, they note faint glimmers of hope, of courage, and of enduring kindness that persists even after worlds have ended. They hum softly of the importance of remembrance, of noticing the subtle threads that survive beyond collapse, and of how even forgotten acts carry weight in the architecture of existence. A particularly reflective letter comes from a cosmic entity who observes the interplay of entropy and creation, the slow weaving of order and chaos across realities. They write softly of the ways Ooo and its heroes fit into this larger pattern of how courage, kindness, and curiosity are forms of energy that ripple across worlds. They reflect on how small gestures, helping a friend, choosing to act with honesty, or standing against injustice, send waves through the multiverse, altering probabilities and shaping the texture of reality itself. Their words hum with gentle wonder, noting that even when the scales of existence feel overwhelmingly vast, every thoughtful action resonates. Another letter arrives from a being who measures time not linearly, but as a fluid tapestry, where moments fold, overlap, and echo. They write of observing alternate versions of Finn, Jake, and countless denizens of Ooo simultaneously, each decision refracting across a spectrum of possibility. They hum softly about the subtle courage required to navigate life, when every choice carries infinite potential, and about the quiet strength of those who act despite uncertainty, who persist in hope even when outcomes cannot be known. Their letter reminds us that bravery is often invisible, quiet, and enduring, yet it shapes the architecture of all worlds. One letter drifts from a cosmic entity who exists within the spaces between universes, where light bends in impossible ways and existence is a gentle, continuous hum. They write of observing heroes from a distance, noting how the ripples of kindness, courage, and laughter reach even beings like themselves, touching the void with warmth. They hum with reflective reverence for the ways Oo's adventurers create resonance, for the subtle magic in moments of empathy, humor, and patience. They remind us that even entities of unfathomable scale are affected by the soft presence of hearts willing to act with care. Another letter comes from a being who has watched civilizations rise and fall repeatedly, recording their triumphs, mistakes, and quiet acts of grace. They write of the delicate symmetry of life and death, of creation and decay, and of the small sparks of courage that illuminate even the darkest epochs. They hum gently about the way these sparks endure, creating patterns that guide future heroes, shaping the rhythm of existence. They reflect that even when entire worlds are lost, the subtle echoes of care, bravery, and curiosity persist, threading through space and time like faint, iridescent light. A letter arrives from a cosmic entity whose consciousness spans multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing them to observe myriad lives at once. They write softly of noticing patterns, of recognizing courage in both grand acts and tender moments, and of understanding that heroism is not only about outcomes, but about intention, awareness, and gentle persistence. They hum quietly about the interplay between mortal hearts and cosmic currents, and how even small acts of bravery influence far more than anyone can perceive. One final letter in this opening section comes from a being who exists in the quiet spaces before universes are born, where potential hums like a low, steady note across nothingness. They write of watching possibilities bloom, of sensing the subtle threads that will one day form worlds like Ooo, and of the heroes whose choices will ripple outward before they have even taken form. Their words carry a gentle gravity, a soft, infinite patience, and a quiet awe for the courage and curiosity of beings who, though mortal and fleeting, leave marks that endure in the weave of existence. They hum softly, a resonance that reaches even into our hearts, reminding us that every act of attention, care, and bravery contributes to the unfolding of worlds. We continue drifting through the letters of cosmic entities, voices that hum across time and space, reflecting on Ooo, its heroes, and the subtle threads of existence. One letter arrives from a being who exists in the heart of a dying star, whose consciousness stretches across eons. They write of watching light travel, of observing worlds emerge and fade, and of the quiet courage displayed by those who act, despite knowing their deeds may leave no lasting mark. They hum softly about Finn, Jake, and the inhabitants of Ooo, noting how small choices, offering kindness, standing against injustice, listening with patience, send ripples that persist far longer than any mortal can imagine. Their letter is filled with reverent calm, a gentle reminder that even transient lives resonate across eternity. Another letter drifts from a cosmic entity who resides in the spaces between thought and time, where possibilities flow like rivers and destinies shift like sands. They write of watching alternate versions of heroes, of observing the infinite ways courage and compassion manifest across realities. They reflect on how bravery often exists in quiet persistence, in the willingness to care, and in the choice to act even when outcomes are uncertain. They hum softly about the subtle echoes that connect all things, noting that even the smallest gestures in Ooo, sharing a meal, telling a story, lending a hand, shape the weave of universes in ways unseen but profound. One letter arrives from a being who dwells in the quiet expanse between creation and entropy, where universes are born and collapse in gentle rhythm. They write of observing civilizations, kingdoms, and adventurers, noting that heroism is not solely in grand battles or spectacular feats, but in the accumulation of small, thoughtful actions. They hum with reflective calm, marveling at how the laughter of children, the courage of a boy wielding a sword, and the steadfast loyalty of friends create resonance that endure beyond the life of a single world. Their words carry the quiet gravity of infinity, yet speak softly, as if comforting rather than instructing. Another letter drifts from a cosmic entity who has witnessed the death of countless stars and the quiet emergence of new galaxies. They write softly of the persistence of hope, the tenacity of kindness, and the endurance of courage, even when civilizations fade into silence. They hum gently about the interplay of light and shadow, creation and decay, noting that acts of empathy, bravery, and joy leave imprints in the cosmos that guide the flow of future events. They remind us that heroism often appears in subtle forms, quietly shaping worlds while remaining largely unseen. A particularly reflective letter comes from a being who exists in the web of interdimensional currents, where every choice creates a ripple, and every thought can shift a reality. They write of observing Finn and Jake, marveling at how their simple decisions, choosing to help a friend, protecting an innocent, or pursuing curiosity, send vibrations across realms. They hum softly about the profound subtlety of influence, noting that even beings of infinite scale are affected by these acts, and that the universe itself responds to the courage and compassion of mortals in ways too delicate to measure, but impossible to ignore. Another letter arrives from a cosmic entity who perceives time as a living, breathing organism, with moments expanding and contracting in gentle pulses. They write of noticing the careful attention heroes pay to small details, of how empathy and courage, though quiet, create patterns that persist across time. They hum softly about the way hope threads through all realities, carried by acts of care, laughter, and bravery. They reflect on the beauty of persistence, the quiet majesty of choosing goodness, and the gentle power of those who, though fleeting, leave a mark that echoes indefinitely. One letter drifts from a being who exists at the intersection of multiple universes, a place where realities shimmer and overlap like translucent veils. They write of observing countless versions of Ooo and its inhabitants, marveling at how courage and kindness adapt to circumstance. They hum softly about the subtle brilliance of heroism, noting that even small gestures, listening, comforting, guiding, ripple through these overlapping worlds, shaping the experiences of countless lives. They reflect that the impact of Finn, Jake, and their companions extends far beyond the tangible, touching dimensions, entities, and hearts that will never be seen directly. Another letter arrives from a cosmic entity who has existed since the first thought of existence, a witness to the birth of consciousness itself. They write of marveling at the courage of those who act despite fear, the quiet persistence of those who maintain hope, and the delicate artistry of nurturing connection across worlds. They hum with reflective wonder, noting that even in the vastness of time and space, the smallest acts of empathy, curiosity, and bravery create harmonies that resonate across dimensions. They remind us that heroism is woven not only in deeds, but in intention, perception, and care. A final letter in this section comes from a being who inhabits the spaces beyond memory, where lost worlds and forgotten lives mingle. They write softly of observing the ebb and flow of existence, noting that even when civilizations vanish, when stories fade, and when heroes are forgotten, the ripples of courage, kindness, and love persist. They hum gently about the importance of witnessing, of remembering, and of honoring the quiet acts that shape reality. They reflect that every choice made with care, every action taken with empathy, leaves an enduring mark upon the cosmos, subtle but eternal. We continue drifting through the vast, resonant letters of cosmic entities, voices that speak in gentle currents of thought and light, observing Ooo, its heroes, and the subtle rhythms of existence. One letter arrives from a being whose consciousness stretches across nebulae, whose thoughts hum with the slow pulse of galaxies. They write of witnessing worlds unfold like petals, each choice by a hero or a child shaping the future in ways imperceptible yet profound. They hum softly of Finn and Jake, marveling at the courage it takes to act when outcomes are uncertain, to care when the world offers no guarantee of reward, and to persist in hope when shadows loom. Their words are both immense and tender, a gentle reminder that even in the vastness of space, every small act resonates. Another letter drifts from an entity who inhabits the spaces between reality and imagination, a being whose perception encompasses both what is and what could be. They write of observing countless variations of Ooo and its adventurers, noting that bravery is not always measured by heroics alone, but also by the quiet choice to be present, to listen, and to offer care. They hum softly about the subtle ways that courage, curiosity, and empathy propagate through the cosmos, threading together realities and binding moments across time. They remind us that the smallest gestures, words spoken gently, hands extended in aid, laughter shared amidst danger, carry echoes that outlast entire civilizations. One letter comes from a being who resides in the twilight spaces between creation and oblivion, where universes bloom and fade like ephemeral blossoms. They write of the patterns that emerge from the actions of heroes, noting that even fleeting moments of bravery ripple outward in concentric waves, shaping probability, memory, and the very fabric of reality. They hum softly about the beauty of impermanence, observing how Oo's adventures, though temporary in cosmic time, carry resonance far beyond their apparent limits. Their words evoke quiet awe, emphasizing that courage and kindness endure in forms invisible to the naked eye, but essential to the balance of existence. Another letter drifts from a being whose mind exists across the intersections of timelines, perceiving every possible outcome of every choice. They write of witnessing Finn's decisions in infinite permutations, marveling at the ways bravery manifests differently depending on circumstance, companion, and consequence. They hum softly about the patience required to navigate uncertainty, the quiet fortitude in persisting despite unknowns, and the subtle heroism of maintaining hope, empathy, and connection in worlds that test the heart at every turn. Their letter reminds us that courage is multifaceted, adapting to circumstance while remaining rooted in intention and care. A particularly reflective letter comes from a cosmic entity who exists in the spaces between thought and sensation, perceiving emotions, intentions, and subtle acts of being. They write of the beauty in small acts, a gentle smile, a helping hand, a word spoken softly when fear or grief hovers nearby. They hum with quiet reverence, noting that even in the immense scale of the multiverse, these delicate threads of courage and kindness ripple outward, shaping realities and guiding other beings toward hope and connection. Their letter reflects the soft yet enduring power of moral resonance, of actions carried out with awareness and care. Another letter arrives from a being who inhabits the voids left by collapsed universes, where echoes of lost civilizations linger like faint songs. They write softly of observing what remains, noticing acts of bravery and compassion that persist even after worlds vanish. They hum gently about the power of memory, reflection, and acknowledgement, noting that heroism is not only about shaping the present, but also preserving traces of good across time and space. They reflect on the quiet endurance of hope, the persistence of kindness, and the subtle yet profound ways that moral courage endures beyond the collapse of matter and the fading of light. One letter drifts from a being whose awareness spans both matter and energy, who perceives the dance of atoms as subtly as the arc of planets. They write of noticing patterns of action and intention, of marveling at the courage that emerges in beings who act with care despite limited understanding. They hum softly about Finn and his companions, reflecting on the bravery in choosing empathy, curiosity, and resilience even when facing uncertainty, danger, or loss. Their letter carries calm reverence, suggesting that the smallest conscious acts contribute to the harmony of the cosmos in ways that cannot be quantified, yet are deeply felt. Another letter arrives from a cosmic entity who exists in the liminal spaces between universes, observing the subtle interactions of reality itself. They write of the echoes of laughter, courage, and curiosity emanating from Ooo, noting that these vibrations extend far beyond what any inhabitant could perceive. They hum gently about how heroism manifests not only in deeds of strength or spectacle, but in persistence, thoughtfulness, and the choice to act with intention and care. They remind us that the resonance of these choices carries across dimensions, shaping probabilities, outcomes, and even the consciousness of entities far beyond mortal comprehension. A letter drifts from a being who has existed since the very first flicker of life, a witness to the unfolding of potential across infinite possibilities. They write softly of the courage found in continuity, the bravery in persisting despite uncertainty, and the subtle artistry of nurturing hope. They hum with reflective awe, noting that every act of empathy, protection, and understanding contributes to the symphony of existence. Their words evoke calm wonder, emphasizing that even fleeting lives leave indelible impressions, and that the essence of heroism is as enduring as the universe itself. One final letter for this section comes from a being who exists beyond perception, whose consciousness hums through dimensions unseen. They write of watching the interplay of existence, noticing how courage, love, and curiosity ripple across realities, connecting beings and shaping outcomes in subtle, unseen ways. They hum gently, emphasizing that heroism is not defined solely by deeds, but by the intention and attention behind them, by the care extended to others, and by the persistence of hope, even when faced with uncertainty or despair. Their letter leaves a lingering sense of quiet awe, a reminder that the choices of mortal hearts are threads woven to the vast, unending tapestry of the cosmos. We now drift toward the close of letters from cosmic entities, where the voices of vast consciousnesses mingle in quiet harmony, carrying reflections of Ooo, its heroes, and the unseen threads of existence. One letter arrives from a being who perceives existence as a vast, interconnected web of light and sound, where every action resonates across dimensions. They write softly of observing Finn, Jake, and their companions, marveling at how even the smallest decisions, choosing to help, to comfort, to stand for what is right, create ripples that reach far beyond immediate perception. They hum gently, reflecting on the quiet heroism in persistence, in subtlety, and in the courage to act with care, even when recognition or reward is unlikely. Another letter drifts from an entity whose consciousness stretches across the threshold between life and memory, who perceives not only events, but their echoes across time. They write of watching countless acts of bravery, kindness, and curiosity, noting that these threads endure even when worlds change, kingdoms fall, or heroes vanish. They hum softly about the enduring resonance of moral action, emphasizing that heroism is often invisible to those who live within a single moment, yet it carries weight in the fabric of reality itself. Their letter speaks of quiet awe, a reverent acknowledgement of the persistent light that emerges from mortals' hearts. One letter comes from a being who exists in the folds of collapsed and reborn universes, a consciousness that has witnessed the cycle of creation countless times. They write softly of the courage required to persist in worlds that are fragile, impermanent, and often indifferent. They hum gently about the ways acts of hope, empathy, and courage leave traces beyond collapse, forming subtle patterns that shape new realities. They reflect on Finn's choices and those of his companions, noting that even small gestures, sharing a meal, comforting a friend, extending patience, carries significance beyond what anyone could measure. Another letter drifts from a cosmic entity whose awareness spans the interwoven strands of fate and probability, perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously. They write of observing alternative Finns and their countless decisions, marveling at the myriad ways courage manifests when faced with uncertainty, danger, or moral ambiguity. They hum softly about the quiet heroism of choosing consistently to act with care, empathy, and integrity, noting that these actions echo across timelines, subtly shaping the course of many worlds. Their letter carries calm reverence, a gentle meditation on the interconnectivity of all choices. A reflective letter arrives from a being who exists in the silent spaces between universes, where time slows and memory lingers. They write of witnessing the delicate balance of creation, decay, and persistence, noting that courage is often the quiet act of maintaining hope, even in the face of impermanence. They hum softly about the subtle ripples created by acts of compassion, noting that even when deeds seem insignificant, they leave imprints that guide future possibilities. Their words resonate with calm wisdom, emphasizing that heroism is not always loud or visible, but enduring in its quiet persistence. Another letter drifts from a cosmic entity whose perception includes both matter and intention, seeing not only actions, but the care behind them. They write of observing Finn and Jake, marveling at the bravery inherent in choosing kindness and understanding, despite danger, uncertainty, or fear. They hum gently about how these choices create ripples that shape reality in subtle yet profound ways, and how courage is as much an internal discipline as it is an external demonstration. Their letter carries a quiet, reflective tone, urging recognition of the invisible patterns of heroism that exist in every thoughtful act. One letter arrives from a being who exists beyond light and shadow, beyond space and time, whose awareness hums with the faint echoes of creation itself. They write softly of observing how the laughter, care, and courage of Oo's heroes reverberate across the multiverse, shaping events in ways both subtle and profound. They hum with reflective awe, noting that even the most ordinary moments, a smile, a word of encouragement, a choice to forgive, create ripples that influence the unfolding of realities. Their letters suggest that heroism is often hidden, yet it is the quiet force that sustains balance across worlds. Another letter drifts from a cosmic entity who resides in the interstices of memory and possibility, perceiving both the lives that have been and the potential that may yet unfold. They write of observing Finn and his companions, noting that courage manifests in both dramatic deeds and in gentle persistence. They hum softly about how intention, empathy, and the willingness to act with care, even when unobserved, leave traces that endure beyond mortal comprehension. Their words evoke calm wonder, reminding us that heroism is woven into the tapestry of existence itself. A letter arrives from a being whose consciousness spans the silent voids between collapsing stars, where only the faintest echoes remain. They write of noticing acts of bravery that persist even after worlds have ended, of observing kindness and hope that ripple through time and memory. They hum gently about the subtle ways heroism endures, forming patterns that guide future generations and shaping the potential for life, curiosity, and connection long after the immediate moment has passed. Their letter is a quiet meditation on the persistence of good in a universe that often forgets. One final letter for this segment comes from a cosmic entity who exists in the spaces before thought, before matter, before time itself, where potential hums like a soft, infinite note. They write of observing the first stirrings of worlds like Ooo, of seeing the initial acts of courage, curiosity, and care that will ripple outward for eons. They hum softly, reflecting on the endurance of intention, the subtle persistence of hope, and the quiet heroism inherent in every thoughtful action. They remind us that even fleeting lives, small gestures, and tender choices contribute to the fabric of reality, leaving echoes that resonate across the multiverse long after the moment has passed. As our journey drifts beyond the familiar landscapes of Ooo, we begin to receive letters from civilizations that arose after the kingdoms we know have long faded, and from beings who weave time itself as if it were thread. These letters arrive gently, carried across remnants of memory and echoes of futures that might have been. They tell of worlds shaped by the triumphs and failures of Ooo, civilizations that have learned from the legacies left behind, and chronomancers who observe, record, and sometimes intervene in the delicate currents of temporal flow. Their words hum softly with wisdom, reflection, and quiet reverence. The first letter comes from a civilization that emerged centuries after the fall of familiar Ooo in a world where ruins of Candy Kingdom, Ice Kingdom, and the Fire Kingdom were slowly reclaimed by nature. They write softly of the discovery of artifacts, inscriptions, and faded murals, remnants of stories long forgotten, but imbued with lessons for those who seek them. They hum gently about how these remnants shaped their understanding of courage, friendship, and curiosity. They speak of leaders who study the histories of Finn and his companions, not as heroes to emulate blindly, but as guides for thoughtful living, encouraging citizens to act with care, curiosity, and quiet bravery in the shaping of their society. Another letter drifts from a post-Ooo civilization that developed in a subterranean network of caverns and crystal forests, long after surface kingdoms succumbed to entropy. They write of mapping ruins, preserving fragile memories of history, and of learning to live in harmony with the echoes of the past. They hum softly about the courage required to study what remains without being consumed by it, to honor the deeds of those who came before while creating new paths in the dimly lit corridors of the world. Their letter carries gentle wonder at the ways heroism transcends time, echoing across civilizations even as worlds transform. One letter arrives from a society that emerged in floating archipelagos, where once mighty kingdoms sank beneath oceans and rivers rose to claim the land. They write softly of discovering letters, songs, and stories left by the heroes of old Ooo, finding in them guidance and inspiration. They hum gently about the subtle courage that lies in rebuilding, in nurturing life, and in preserving memory against the persistent tides of change. They note that their understanding of heroism has deepened, recognizing that bravery can take many forms, from grand gestures to quiet stewardship, from exploration to reflection, from leadership to empathy. Another letter drifts from a civilization that arose in a world where magic remained, though in subtle, shifting forms. They write of learning to navigate the balance of wonder and responsibility, of discovering how acts of kindness, curiosity, and courage shape societies over generations. They hum softly about the importance of memory, recording the deeds of heroes like Finn not as monuments, but as living lessons. Their reflections emphasize that heroism endures in choices that honor others, sustain communities, and respect the rhythms of both people and the land, even long after kingdoms fall. A particularly contemplative letter comes from a society that learned to merge technology and magic, integrating the legacy of Oo's heroes with innovations that reshape landscapes, communication, and understanding. They write of studying old maps, inscriptions, and artifacts to guide exploration and cooperation, and of nurturing citizens to act with empathy, integrity, and thoughtful courage. They hum softly about the ways the deeds of Finn, Jake, and their companions ripple outward, influencing not only the physical world, but the moral and cultural fabric of emerging civilizations. Their letter reflects a calm awareness that even the smallest choices in the past can seed the foundations of entire societies in the future. Another letter arrives from a chronomancer, a being who studies time as fluid and alive, capable of observing the folds of past, present, and possible futures simultaneously. They write softly of watching the rise and fall of kingdoms, of tracing the subtle currents of heroism, compassion, and folly. They hum gently about the care required in navigating temporal influence, noting that even minor interventions can ripple across centuries, altering outcomes in ways both gentle and profound. Their reflections emphasize that courage is not always a matter of action in a single moment, but a persistent thread woven across timelines, carrying intention, awareness, and care. One letter drifts from a chronomancer who specializes in observing lost possibilities, the paths that never came to be, and the lives that might have unfolded differently. They write of tracing the echoes of Finn and Jake across alternate realities, reflecting on the subtle courage displayed in decisions both great and small. They hum softly about the beauty of choice, the resonance of kindness, and the enduring impact of thoughtful action. Their words convey a quiet awe at the intricacy of temporal currents, noting that even when outcomes are uncertain, intention and empathy leave traces that endure beyond individual lifespan. Another letter comes from a post-Ooo civilization that arose among the ruins of elemental kingdoms, where once powerful magic lingers in faint, shimmering echoes. They write of learning to interpret traces of history, preserving knowledge, and acting with patience and humility in the face of uncertainty. They hum gently about the courage required to rebuild, to honor what came before, and to create societies that reflect care, curiosity, and integrity. They reflect that heroism is not limited to the deeds of the past, but is continually renewed by the choices of those who inherit the world and the wisdom of its stories. A particularly introspective letter arrives from a chronomancer who observes the intersection of action and consequence, where even minor decisions can cascade across centuries. They write softly of noting how acts of bravery and compassion in Ooo resonate through the fabric of time, influencing civilizations long after the heroes themselves have vanished. They hum gently about the importance of intention, reflection, and persistence, noting that courage endures when it is consistent, thoughtful, and rooted in care for others. Their letter encourages contemplation, inviting readers to consider the quiet power of every choice and every act of empathy. One final letter in this opening section comes from a civilization that emerged in a world where the lands of Ooo were slowly reclaimed by wilderness, where ruins became forests and rivers carried stories through their currents. They write of discovering letters, artifacts, and inscriptions left behind, finding inspiration and guidance in the traces of courage, curiosity, and kindness. They hum softly about the importance of carrying forward lessons from the past, nurturing hope, and creating a world where heroism is not a singular act, but a continuous, living thread woven into the lives of everyone who inhabits it. Their letter closes with a gentle thought, that even after kingdoms fall and heroes vanish, the resonance of their choices endures in the hearts and minds of those who continue to act with care and courage. We continue drifting through the letters of Post-Ooo civilizations and Chronomancers, voices that hum with reverent calm, reflecting on the legacies of Ooo and the enduring echoes of heroism. One letter arrives from a civilization that developed in a landscape once scarred by battles and magical upheaval. They write softly of uncovering remnants of old kingdoms, shattered towers, fragmented maps, inscriptions faded by time, and of interpreting these fragments not as relics of loss, but as guides to cultivate wisdom and care. They hum gently about the courage inherent in preserving memory, in learning from both triumphs and mistakes, and in nurturing communities that thrive through empathy, thoughtfulness, and attentive action. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer whose sight stretches across centuries. They write of observing the subtle ways Oo's heroes influence the formation of new societies, how choices made in courage, kindness, and curiosity sent ripples through generations. They hum softly about the delicate balance required to interact with temporal currents, noting that even when worlds appear static, every action contributes to the subtle shaping of future possibilities. Their reflections emphasize the quiet heroism in maintaining perspective, in learning from what is past, and in understanding that the small, thoughtful acts of one generation resonate far beyond their immediate moment. One letter arrives from a post-Ooo civilization that flourished in abandoned forests, where nature slowly reclaimed ruins and life adapted to coexist with lingering magic. They write softly of discovering signs of Oo's past, the faint glow of ancient spells, the echoes of laughter, the soft hum of songs carried on the wind. They hum gently about the courage required to explore, to preserve, and to interpret these traces without arrogance, to build societies that honor both history and the possibilities of the future. Their words evoke a calm, reflective tone, emphasizing that heroism extends beyond combat or spectacle and is found in careful stewardship, observation, and thoughtful creation. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who watches the folding of timelines, where countless versions of Ooo overlap, intersect, and diverge. They write of observing Finn and Jake navigating these realities, marveling at the quiet courage in their decisions, the care taken in the smallest acts of kindness, and the consistency of their empathy across challenges. They hum softly about how these patterns of heroism resonate beyond singular timelines, guiding other beings, influencing societies, and shaping worlds in subtle, enduring ways. Their reflections convey a gentle awe for the quiet power of intention, attention, and persistent hope. A particularly contemplative letter arrives from a post-Ooo civilization that arose in floating archipelagos above flooded landscapes, where remnants of kingdoms peek through misty waters. They write of reconstructing histories, learning to interpret fragments of letters, murals, and artifacts left behind by the heroes of old Ooo. They hum softly about the courage needed to balance curiosity with caution, to act with patience and respect, and to build a society that honors both memory and possibility. Their letter suggests that heroism is a continuous thread, woven through generations by choices that reflect care, courage, and consideration. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who observes worlds where magic and technology intertwine, studying how civilizations integrate the lessons of Oo's past. They write of tracing the echoes of bravery, empathy, and curiosity in the formation of governance, culture, and education. They hum gently about the subtle courage in ensuring that history guides rather than constrains, and that lessons from heroes like Finn and Jake encourage ongoing reflection, thoughtfulness, and compassion in shaping societies. Their reflections highlight that heroism is not frozen in time, but evolves, adapting to the needs of each new age. One letter arrives from a post-Ooo civilization that rose amidst elemental ruins where the remnants of fire, ice, candy, and slime kingdoms intertwine in the natural environment. They write softly of observing traces of past heroism, noting how acts of courage, empathy, and creativity influence the evolution of society. They hum gently about the quiet power of stewardship, of learning from the balance of nature and the legacies of heroes, and of cultivating communities that reflect thoughtfulness, care, and moral continuity. Their letter conveys calm reverence for the enduring impact of choices made long ago. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who traces the unseen currents of time, observing how minor acts of kindness or bravery ripple into long-term consequences. They write of Finn's choices, Jake's loyalty, and the quiet courage of companions who support and nurture one another, marveling at how these acts guide post-Ooo societies in unexpected ways. They hum softly about the intricate connections between intention and consequence, noting that heroism often manifests quietly in acts that may never be celebrated, yet leave a lasting imprint on the moral and cultural fabric of civilizations. A reflective letter arrives from a post-Ooo civilization that developed within crystal forests and subterranean caverns, where light refracts through magical minerals and memory is preserved in luminescent glyphs. They write softly of discovering remnants of old adventures, of reconstructing stories from letters, murals, and faint echoes of magic. They hum gently about the courage required to honor the past without being trapped by it, to create societies that integrate wisdom, empathy, and careful thought into every choice. Their letter reflects a quiet understanding that heroism is continuous, living not only in actions, but in the ways communities cultivate and carry forward ethical and moral values. One final letter in this section comes from a chronomancer who observes not only what has been and what is, but also the infinite possibilities of what may yet unfold. They write softly of watching the cumulative effects of courage, kindness, and curiosity, noting how the decisions of heroes ripple through time, guiding post-Ooo civilizations in ways subtle yet profound. They hum gently about the quiet endurance of hope, the persistence of moral choice, and the subtle artistry of acting with awareness and care. Their reflections suggest that heroism is both timeless and adaptive, woven into the ongoing flow of existence and carried forward by each generation, willing to honor the legacies of those who came before. We continue gently drifting through the letters of post-Ooo civilizations and chronomancers, voices carrying the quiet reflections of worlds shaped by the legacies of Ooo and the subtle guidance of those who observe time itself. One letter arrives from a civilization that has grown among the ruins of ancient kingdoms, where vines curl through broken towers and rivers carry fragments of forgotten stories. They write softly of uncovering inscriptions, letters, and murals left behind by the heroes of Ooo, and of interpreting these not as relics of grandeur, but as guides to live with awareness, empathy, and courage. They hum gently about the persistence of heroism, noting that the choices of Finn, Jake, and their companions echo not only in their own time, but in the shaping of entire societies, reminding each generation that small acts of care have enduring weight. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who perceives time as a flowing river, bending and branching with countless currents of possibility. They write of observing the impact of even the quietest deeds, marveling at how Finn's choices, Jake's loyalty, and the courage of countless companions ripple outward across decades and centuries. They hum softly about the subtle art of guiding without forcing, of observing without overwhelming, and of preserving the threads of hope and empathy in ways that allow future civilizations to flourish. Their words carry a reflective calm, emphasizing that heroism is as much about intention and care as it is about action, and that the effects of thoughtful deeds persist far beyond what any observer could measure. One letter arrives from a post-Ooo civilization that has learned to harmonize with the lingering magic of the land, building communities among floating islands, crystal forests, and ancient ruins. They write softly of deciphering letters, artifacts, and murals left behind by past heroes, learning to balance curiosity with caution, exploration with stewardship. They hum gently about the courage required to preserve knowledge, to honor the past without being bound by it, and to act with care toward both people and the environment. Their reflections suggest that heroism is not confined to grand gestures or epic battles, but lives in the choices to nurture, to observe, and to act thoughtfully in every aspect of life. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who navigates the intersections of timelines, observing both what has occurred and what might have been. They write of noticing patterns of courage, empathy, and curiosity that persist across alternate realities, marveling at the quiet consistency of heroism in its many forms. They hum softly about the enduring influence of intentional action, noting that even when outcomes are uncertain, the persistent choice to act with awareness and care send ripples through both time and society. Their words are reflective, almost meditative, emphasizing that the subtle acts of a single individual can guide the ethical and cultural evolution of civilizations long after the moment has passed. A particularly contemplative letter arrives from a post-Ooo civilization that has learned to integrate lessons from the past into the fabric of daily life, where education, storytelling, and reflection are valued alongside exploration and survival. They write softly of preserving the letters, songs, and murals of heroes, interpreting them as living guidance rather than static history. They hum gently about the courage needed to continually reflect, to act with empathy, and to nurture hope, even in the face of uncertainty or hardship. Their letter conveys the idea that heroism is continuous, a living thread woven through time, sustained by every generation willing to act with care. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who studies not only the flow of events, but the interplay of moral resonance across timelines. They write of observing Finn, Jake, and companions in countless iterations, noting the quiet heroism, inconsistent empathy, loyalty, and curiosity. They hum softly about how even small decisions, helping a friend, telling the truth, protecting the innocent, contribute to the long-term shaping of civilizations. Their reflections emphasize that courage and moral clarity are enduring forces, subtly guiding societies long after individual lives have ended. One letter arrives from a Post-Ooo civilization that thrives amid elemental ruin, where the traces of fire, ice, candy, and slime kingdoms inform architecture, governance, and culture. They write softly of observing the legacies of heroes, of how acts of bravery and kindness ripple into their society, shaping norms, values, and ethics. They hum gently about the importance of intentional action, of building structures and traditions that reflect care and foresight, and of nurturing generations who recognize that heroism is as much about cultivating moral and communal strength as it is about individual feats. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who perceives the infinite potential of actions across intersecting timelines. They write of observing the persistent resonance of choices made by Finn and Jake, noting that courage, curiosity, and empathy are qualities that extend beyond the immediate, influencing the ethical and emotional landscape of entire civilizations. They hum softly about the subtle artistry of temporal guidance, emphasizing that heroism endures when grounded in awareness, intentionality, and moral consistency, and that the quiet decisions of the present shape the possibilities of the future. A reflective letter arrives from a Post-Ooo civilization that has grown among reclaimed forests, rivers, and ruins, where life flourishes amidst the echoes of ancient kingdoms. They write softly of discovering letters, murals, and artifacts, and of drawing inspiration from the courage and care embedded in them. They hum gently about the bravery required to learn from the past, to act with empathy, and to cultivate hope, understanding that heroism is a continuous process, carried forward by every thoughtful choice and deliberate action. Their reflections suggest that even after centuries, the resonance of Finn and Jake's actions persists, guiding civilizations toward balance, compassion, and understanding. One final letter in this section comes from a chronomancer who exists beyond linear time, observing the continuous interplay of choice, consequence, and moral resonance. They write softly of watching Post-Ooo civilizations integrate the lessons of history, learning to act with courage, care, and foresight. They hum gently about the enduring influence of thoughtful action, the quiet persistence of hope, and the subtle artistry of living with awareness. Their words remind us that heroism is not only about extraordinary deeds, but also about the consistent, reflective choices that shape the lives, cultures, and possibilities of generations to come. We now drift into the final letters of letters from Post-Ooo civilizations and chronomancers, voices carrying the soft resonance of time, memory, and reflection. One letter arrives from a Post-Ooo civilization that exists in a valley carved from the remnants of the old kingdoms, where rivers trace the outlines of ancient ruins and forests whisper stories long forgotten. They write softly of how the inhabitants study the deeds of heroes like Finn and Jake, not for glory, but for guidance, learning to act with empathy, patience, and courage. They hum gently about the quiet heroism found in preserving knowledge, nurturing communities, and honoring the past while building toward a thoughtful future. They remind us that courage is not only an action, but a state of being, cultivated and passed on through generations. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who perceives time as a lattice of infinite possibilities, each decision a node, each act a ripple. They write of observing countless worlds where Oo's legacy lingers, noting how even seemingly insignificant acts, choosing kindness, speaking a word of truth, or offering support, extend far beyond the moment. They hum softly about the subtle courage inherent in consistency, in maintaining empathy and integrity across challenges, and in understanding that heroism is as much about persistence and care as it is about spectacle. Their reflections invite calm contemplation, a gentle acknowledgement that each choice contributes to the moral and temporal tapestry of the universe. One letter arrives from a civilization that developed among floating islands and crystalline forests where magic and memory intertwine. They write softly of discovering letters, murals, and artifacts left by Oo's heroes, and of learning to live in harmony with the echoes of the past. They hum gently about the courage required to navigate uncertainty, to preserve the lessons of history without being confined by it, and to build societies guided by empathy, reflection, and curiosity. Their reflections suggest that heroism is not a single act, but an ongoing process, a continuous thread woven through communities and generations. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who traces the invisible currents that connect cause and effect across timelines. They write of observing Finn and Jake, marveling at the quiet courage in their choices, the care with which they act, and the way their deeds ripple outward through time. They hum softly about how acts of kindness and bravery leave echoes that guide civilizations far beyond the immediate moment. Their reflections highlight the subtlety of heroism, reminding us that courage and empathy persist even when unseen, influencing outcomes in ways that are profound yet gentle. A particularly reflective letter arrives from a Post-Ooo civilization that has learned to integrate the wisdom of past heroes into every aspect of life. They write softly of teaching children to value empathy, curiosity, and courage, of building communities that honor the past while preparing for the uncertainties of the future. They hum gently about the bravery in everyday actions, the choice to listen, to act thoughtfully, and to protect what is vulnerable. Their reflections suggest that heroism endures when it is lived daily, quietly, and with mindful intention, shaping societies as much as extraordinary feats do. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who observes not only what has happened, but what might have happened, tracing the infinite potential of every decision. They write softly of how even minor gestures of care, patience, and bravery ripple outward, influencing civilizations, timelines, and possibilities. They hum gently about the quiet courage of maintaining hope, of choosing kindness, and of acting with awareness in each moment. Their reflections convey calm reverence for the unseen impact of deliberate, thoughtful action, highlighting that heroism is woven into the choices that sustain moral and temporal continuity. One letter arrives from a post-Ooo civilization that thrives in the reclaimed forests and valleys of old kingdoms. They write softly of observing the ruins, interpreting inscriptions, and reconstructing the lessons of the past. They hum gently about the courage needed to preserve knowledge and act with integrity, emphasizing that heroism exists not only in extraordinary deeds, but also in the daily choices that nurture empathy, hope, and communal care. Their reflections suggest that the resonance of past heroes continues to guide them, shaping societies in subtle, enduring ways. Another letter drifts from a chronomancer who exists in the spaces between moments, where time flows softly like a quiet stream. They write of watching Post-Ooo civilizations grow, learning to honor the legacies of past heroes, while creating their own acts of courage and care. They hum softly about the persistence of moral choice, the quiet artistry of living with awareness, and the enduring power of small, thoughtful acts. Their reflections highlight that heroism is an ongoing thread, stitched through time by every being willing to act with care, empathy, and courage. A final letter arrives from a civilization that has grown in harmony with the remnants of Oo's kingdoms, where rivers carry stories and forests preserve memory. They write softly of learning from the past while building for the future, of nurturing communities that act with intention, compassion, and bravery. They hum gently about the subtle ways heroism endures through time, guiding societies, inspiring individuals, and preserving hope. Their reflections offer calm reassurance that the deeds of the past continue to shape the present and future in ways that are both profound and tender. The final letter drifts from a chronomancer who watches over the intertwining currents of past, present, and potential. They write softly of the endurance of heroism, noting that every act of courage, empathy, and thoughtful care leaves a trace in the fabric of time, shaping worlds, guiding societies, and inspiring future generations. They hum gently about the quiet beauty of persistence, reflection, and intention, reminding us that even fleeting lives contribute to the ongoing story of existence. As the letter concludes, the words seem to settle like soft starlight across the mind, carrying a final, gentle reminder of continuity, hope, and the enduring resonance of courage across time and space. Good night.